The trolley problem, classic version and variations. A runaway trolley speeds toward 5 people tied to the tracks, certain death awaiting them all. You stand beside a lever that can divert the trolley to a side track, where only 1 person lies bound. Do you pull the lever, actively causing 1 death to prevent 5? This isn't just a thought experiment, it's a window into the machinery of moral reasoning itself. The trolley problem, first introduced by philosopher Philippa Foot in 1967 and later developed by Judith Jarvis Thomson, forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that our moral intuitions often conflict with logical consistency. Most people intuitively say yes, pull the lever. The mathematics seems clear. 5 lives outweigh 1. But dig deeper and the certainty crumbles. You're not merely allowing deaths to occur through inaction, you're actively choosing to kill. Your hand on that lever transforms you from bystander to executioner. Consider the variations that make this even more unsettling. What if the 1 person on the sidetrack is your child, your spouse, your closest friend? What if the 5 are strangers, but the 1 is a brilliant scientist on the verge of curing cancer? What if the 5 are elderly and the 1 is young? What if you learn the 5 people tied themselves to the tracks in a suicide pact, while the 1 was placed there against their will? The loop variation adds another layer of moral complexity. Here, the sidetrack loops back to the main track, and the 1 person's body is needed to stop the trolley from continuing to kill the 5. Now you're not just diverting death, you're using someone as a mere means to an end, treating them as a tool rather than a person with inherent dignity. Then there's the fat man variation, which we'll explore next. Or consider the transplant case. 5 patients need organ donations to survive, and 1 healthy person walks into the hospital. The utilitarian calculus is identical to the trolley problem, yet killing the healthy person to harvest their organs feels fundamentally different. These scenarios reveal the tension between 2 major ethical frameworks. Act utilitarianism suggests we should always choose the action that produces the greatest good for the greatest number. From this perspective, pulling the lever is not just permissible but morally required. Yet deontological ethics, championed by philosophers like Immanuel Kant, argues that some actions are inherently wrong regardless of consequences. The act of intentionally killing, even to save others, violates the categorical imperative to treat people as ends in themselves, never merely as means. Neuroscience has begun to illuminate why these moral dilemmas feel so uncomfortable. Brain imaging studies show that personal moral dilemmas, those requiring direct, intentional harm, activate emotional centers like the anterior cingulate cortex and medial prefrontal cortex. Impersonal dilemmas activate more analytical regions. We're literally of 2 minds about morality, our emotional and rational systems often pulling in opposite directions. The trolley problem also raises questions about the distinction between killing and letting die. Is there a meaningful moral difference between actively causing harm and passively allowing it to occur? Traditional medical ethics suggests there is. Doctors may withdraw treatment, letting die, but cannot administer lethal injections, killing, even when the patient's suffering and the outcome are identical. Cultural factors complicate matters further. Studies suggest that people from more individualistic cultures are more likely to pull the lever, while those from collectivistic cultures show more variation based on the social relationships between the potential victims. Our moral intuitions aren't universal constants but products of our cultural evolution. As you drift toward sleep, consider this. Every day you make decisions that could save lives, donating to effective charities, choosing more ethical consumption patterns, advocating for better policies. Yet most of us don't agonize over these choices the way we do over the trolley problem. Is our moral psychology calibrated for ancient, immediate dilemmas rather than the complex, distant consequences of modern life? The trolley may be bearing down on all of us, and the lever may already be in our hands. The Footbridge Dilemma, modification of trolley problem. You're standing on a footbridge overlooking the same trolley track. Below, the runaway trolley races toward 5 unsuspecting workers. This time there's no lever, no switch to pull. But standing next to you is a very large person whose body, if pushed off the bridge, would stop the trolley and save the 5 lives. Do you push them? The mathematics remain identical. 1 life for 5, yet something feels fundamentally different. While 85% of people say they pull the lever in the original trolley problem, only 12% say they push the large person off the bridge. This stark difference reveals the hidden architecture of our moral minds. The Footbridge Dilemma, introduced by Judith Jarvis Thomson, exposes what philosophers call the doctrine of doing and allowing. There's something about using your hands to push someone to their death that feels qualitatively different from pulling a lever, even when the causal chain and consequences are equivalent. It's the difference between a weapon and a tool, between intimate violence and mechanical distance. Think about the physical sensations involved. Pulling a lever requires minimal force, a simple mechanical action that could be reversed if you changed your mind mid-motion. Pushing someone off a bridge requires sustained physical force against their resistance. You'd feel their body's warmth, perhaps hear their surprise or protest. The tactile immediacy makes the action undeniably personal, embedding you in the violence in a way that lever pulling does not. But why should physical proximity matter morally? If you're willing to kill one to save five through mechanical means, what rational basis do you have for refusing to do the same through physical force? Some philosophers argue there is none, that the difference is purely psychological, a quirk of evolution that makes us more squeamish about up-close and personal violence than distant harm. Others contend that the difference runs deeper. Pushing someone off a bridge violates their autonomy more directly than pulling a lever. The large person becomes a tool in your hands, reduced to their instrumental value as a trolley stopper. They're not merely affected by your decision, they're physically manipulated by it. This transformation of person into object might constitute a more fundamental violation of human dignity. The dilemma becomes even more complex when we consider consent and communication. In the lever scenario, all parties are equally unaware and unable to consent. But on the footbridge, you might be able to explain the situation to the large person. What if they refuse to sacrifice themselves? What if they agree but ask for a moment to say goodbye to loved ones first? What if they volunteer before you even suggest it? Consider variations that blur the moral lines further. What if instead of pushing the person you could convince them to jump? What if you could give them a gentle nudge while they were already leaning dangerously over the railing? What if the person is suicidal and has been contemplating jumping anyway? Each modification reveals new moral nuances about agency, manipulation, and the ethics of using people's existing vulnerabilities. The legal implications differ dramatically too. Pulling a lever might be seen as an emergency decision, possibly even heroic. Pushing someone off a bridge would likely constitute murder in most legal systems, regardless of the utilitarian justification. This gap between moral philosophy and legal reality highlights the challenge of translating ethical theories into practical social norms. Neuroimaging studies reveal why these scenarios feel so different. The Footbridge Dilemma activates brain regions associated with social cognition and emotional processing, areas that evolve to navigate complex interpersonal relationships. We're hardwired to respond differently to harm that involves direct physical contact with another person. Some critics argue that the footbridge scenario is unfairly loaded with irrelevant emotional factors. They propose cleaner versions. What if you could push the person using a mechanical device? What if you activated a trapdoor beneath their feet? As the scenario becomes more mechanized, more people become willing to sacrifice the one for the five, suggesting that our intuitions may indeed be swayed by morally irrelevant factors. The dilemma also raises uncomfortable questions about discrimination. Studies suggest people are more willing to push individuals they perceive as different from themselves, different races, ages, or social classes. If our moral intuitions are contaminated by bias, can we trust them as guides to ethical action? As you contemplate this scenario in the space between waking and sleeping, consider the trolleys in your own life. When have you chosen emotional comfort over moral consistency? When have you let the immediacy of an action cloud your judgment about its consequences? The footbridge looms in countless daily decisions. Every time we choose convenience over conscience, proximity over principle. We are all potential pushers, all potential victims standing on the bridge of moral choice. The Euthyphro Dilemma, God and morality. Is something morally good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is morally good? This question, first posed by Plato in his dialogue Euthyphro, has puzzled theologians and philosophers for over 2 millennia, striking at the very foundation of religious ethics. The dilemma emerges from a conversation between Socrates and Euthyphro, who claims to understand piety so well that he's prosecuting his own father for murder. Socrates, in his typical fashion, probes deeper. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? At first glance, this might seem like abstract theological hair-splitting. But the implications are profound, reaching into every corner of moral reasoning. If things are good simply because God commands them, the first horn of the dilemma, then morality becomes arbitrary. God could theoretically command murder, torture, or cruelty, and these acts would become morally good by divine fiat. This makes morality contingent and potentially capricious, dependent on the whims of an all-powerful being. Consider the disturbing implications. If God commanded genocide, would genocide become morally right? If divine decree made cruelty virtuous, would we be obligated to be cruel? The first horn seems to empty morality of its substance, making good merely a synonym for commanded by God, without independent meaning. But the second horn brings its own troubles. If God commands things because they are already morally good, then goodness exists independently of God. This suggests that moral truths are eternal, abstract entities that even an omnipotent being must acknowledge and follow. Such a view seems to limit God's sovereignty, making the divine subject to external moral laws rather than their author. Modern formulations of the dilemma often replace God with divine command theory or explore it through different religious traditions. In Islam, the tension appears in debates about whether Allah's commands are arbitrary or reflect eternal moral truths. Jewish philosophy grapples with whether the mitzvot, commandments, are good in themselves or good because they express divine will. Christianity faces the challenge of reconciling God's omnipotence with moral absolutes. Some theologians attempt to escape the dilemma by arguing that it presents a false choice. They propose that God's nature itself is the standard of goodness, that moral properties flow from divine character rather than divine commands. On this view, God doesn't arbitrarily choose what's good, nor does he discover external moral truths. Instead, goodness is grounded in God's unchanging, perfect nature. But this solution raises new questions. If God's nature determines morality, what does it mean to praise God as good? Are we simply saying that God conforms to God's own nature, a tautology that seems to drain moral praise of meaning? And how do we distinguish between different aspects of purported divine nature to determine which ones ground moral obligations? The dilemma extends beyond theistic contexts into secular moral philosophy. Replace God with evolution, society, or reason, and similar problems emerge. If evolution shaped our moral intuitions, are those intuitions arbitrary products of natural selection, or do they track genuine moral truths? If society determines right and wrong, is morality merely cultural convention, or do social norms reflect deeper moral realities? Consider how this plays out in practical ethics. When religious traditions change their moral positions, accepting divorce, ordaining women, embracing racial equality, what justifies these changes? If the old positions were divinely commanded, why abandon them? If they weren't truly divine commands, how do we distinguish authentic divine will from human interpretation? The dilemma also illuminates tensions within individual moral reasoning. Many people believe both that objective moral truths exist and that their religious tradition provides access to these truths. But when tradition and moral intuition conflict, as they might regarding slavery, gender roles, or sexuality, which takes precedence, the believer faces their own version of the Euthyphro Dilemma. Some philosophers argue that the dilemma reveals the impossibility of grounding ethics in religion. They contend that truly autonomous moral reasoning requires independence from religious authority. Others maintain that only divine foundation can provide the objectivity and authority that morality requires, and that secular alternatives face equally troubling arbitrariness problems. The contemporary landscape offers new variations. If we create artificial intelligence systems with moral reasoning capabilities, who or what determines their ethical parameters? If we discover extraterrestrial life with different moral systems, which framework takes precedence? As we contemplate genetic engineering and human enhancement, what determines the moral boundaries of these interventions? Historical examples add sobering complexity. The Crusades, the Inquisition, slavery, and countless other atrocities have been justified through divine command interpretations. Yet religious traditions have also motivated profound moral progress. Abolition movements, civil rights activism, charitable works, and social justice advocacy often draw heavily on religious conviction. As consciousness fades and sleep approaches, the dilemma persists in questions that touch every moral choice. When you decide what's right or wrong, what authority do you consult? Your intuitions, your culture, your reasoning, your faith? And whatever source you choose, why should that source be trusted? The gods may be silent, but the question of what makes their commands, or any commands, morally binding echoes through every ethical decision we face. The prisoner's dilemma, cooperation versus self-interest. Two prisoners sit in separate cells, unable to communicate, each facing a choice that will determine both their fates. The prosecutor offers each the same deal: testify against your partner and go free while they serve 10 years, or remain silent and risk the consequences. If both testify, both get 5 years. If both remain silent, both get only 1 year on a lesser charge. This scenario, formalized by mathematicians Merrill Flood and Melvin Drescher at Rand Corporation in 1950, reveals the tragic tension between individual rationality and collective good. Each prisoner, thinking logically, should testify. If your partner stays silent, you go free by testifying versus 1 year by staying silent. If your partner testifies, you get 5 years by testifying versus 10 by staying silent. Testifying dominates staying silent regardless of what the other person does. Yet if both prisoners follow this rational logic, they both get 5 years instead of the 1 year they would receive by both staying silent. Individual rationality leads to collective irrationality, a paradox that haunts human cooperation at every scale. The dilemma extends far beyond prison walls into the fabric of social existence. Every day we face prisoners' dilemmas in disguise. Should you cheat on your taxes when others might be doing the same? Should you use extra water during a drought if your neighbors aren't conserving? Should you arrive early to claim the best parking spots, knowing that if everyone does this, everyone ends up worse off waiting in longer lines? Climate change represents perhaps the ultimate prisoner's dilemma. Each nation faces a choice: reduce emissions at economic cost, or continue polluting while hoping others will bear the burden of environmental protection. If everyone reduces emissions, everyone benefits from a stable climate. If no one reduces emissions, everyone suffers from climate catastrophe. But for any individual nation, the temptation exists to free ride on others' efforts, gaining competitive advantage by avoiding emission costs while still benefiting from global climate stability. The tragedy deepens when we consider repeated interactions. In a one-shot prisoner's dilemma, betrayal might seem rational. But real life rarely offers single encounters. Reputation matters. Future cooperation depends on current trustworthiness. This transforms the game entirely, opening possibilities for strategies like tit for tat. Cooperate initially, then mirror whatever your partner did in the previous round. Robert Axelrod's famous computer tournaments in the 1980s revealed that simple cooperative strategies often outperform complex competitive ones in iterated prisoners' dilemmas. The winning strategy, submitted by Anatole Rappaport, was remarkably straightforward: be nice, never betray first; be forgiving, don't hold grudges; be retaliatory, punish betrayal; and be clear, make your strategy obvious to others. But even repeated games offer no guarantee of cooperation. If both players know exactly when the interactions will end, they can reason backward from the final round. In the last round, there's no future cooperation to protect, so betrayal becomes rational. But if betrayal is rational in the last round, why cooperate in the second-to-last round? This backward induction unravels cooperation entirely, suggesting that finite relationships inevitably end in mutual betrayal. The psychological reality proves more complex than the mathematical model suggests. Humans aren't perfectly rational calculators but emotional beings influenced by fairness, reciprocity, guilt, and empathy. Laboratory experiments show that cooperation rates vary dramatically based on how the dilemma is framed. Calling it the community game increases cooperation compared to calling it the Wall Street game, even when the underlying payoffs remain identical. Cultural differences add another layer of complexity. Societies with stronger norms of reciprocity and collective responsibility show higher cooperation rates. Some cultures emphasize honor and face-saving, making betrayal more costly in reputational terms. Others prioritize individual achievement, making competitive strategies more socially acceptable. The dilemma becomes even more intricate when we consider asymmetric payoffs. What if one prisoner has more to lose from cooperation? What if their crimes were different, their sentences potentially different, their relationships with the prosecutor different? Real-world cooperation dilemmas rarely involve perfectly symmetric situations. Modern technology creates new variants of the prisoner's dilemma. Social media platforms face choices about content moderation, strict policies that might drive users to competitors, or lax policies that might degrade the overall user experience. Companies deciding whether to invest in cybersecurity face similar dynamics. Those who invest heavily might be at competitive disadvantage, but if no one invests, everyone becomes vulnerable to systemic attacks. The dilemma illuminates fundamental questions about human nature. Are we naturally cooperative beings corrupted by competitive institutions, or competitive beings who must be incentivized to cooperate? Archaeological evidence suggests that early human societies developed elaborate mechanisms for promoting cooperation: gift exchange, reputation systems, punishment of free riders, and social norms that make betrayal costly. Consider marriage as an extended prisoner's dilemma. Each partner repeatedly chooses between selfish behavior, pursuing individual interests at the partner's expense, and cooperative behavior, making sacrifices for mutual benefit. Successful marriages often develop implicit strategies resembling those successful in prisoner's dilemma tournaments, starting with trust, reciprocating kindness, punishing betrayal proportionally, and forgiving past transgressions. The dilemma also raises questions about moral obligation. Even if betrayal is individually rational, does that make it morally right? Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative suggests we should act only according to principles we could will to be universal laws. If everyone betrayed in prisoner's dilemmas, the institution of cooperation would collapse entirely, an outcome no rational person could desire. As you drift between consciousness and sleep, consider the prisoner's dilemmas embedded in your daily choices. Every act of kindness, every moment of honesty, every decision to contribute to collective goods rather than free ride on others' efforts represents a choice between cooperation and defection. The bars of the prison may be invisible, but the dilemma remains. In a world where everyone faces the same choice between self-interest and mutual benefit, what will you choose? Lifeboat Ethics, Resource Scarcity Dilemma. The ship has sunk, and you find yourself in a lifeboat designed for 20 people but carrying 25. The boat sits dangerously low in the water, taking on spray with each wave. Rescue remains days away if it comes at all. 5 people must go overboard or everyone will likely perish. Who lives and who dies? And who decides? This nightmare scenario, popularized by philosopher Garrett Hardin in the 1970s, forces us to confront the brutal mathematics of survival and the impossibility of fair distribution when resources fall short of needs. Unlike philosophical thought experiments that remain safely abstract, lifeboat ethics reflects real dilemmas faced throughout human history, from actual maritime disasters to resource allocation in hospitals, refugee camps, and disaster zones. Hardin used the lifeboat metaphor to argue against unrestricted immigration and foreign aid, suggesting that wealthy nations were like lifeboats that would sink if they took on too many people from drowning nations. His arguments proved controversial, accused of justifying heartless policies toward the global poor. But the underlying ethical dilemma transcends any particular political application. When resources are genuinely scarce, how do we decide who gets them? The most obvious approach might be random selection, drawing straws or flipping coins to determine who goes overboard. This method treats all lives as equally valuable and avoids the moral hazard of having people judge each other's worth. No one could complain about unfairness in the selection process itself, though they might question whether any selection process is justified. But random selection ignores potentially relevant differences between people. Should pregnant women receive priority? Children who have more years of life ahead? The captain who has special knowledge needed for navigation? Someone with medical training who might help treat injuries? The process that seems most fair in abstract terms might produce outcomes that feel deeply unfair in concrete circumstances. Merit-based selection offers an alternative: save those who contribute most to everyone's survival chances. But who judges merit and by what criteria? Physical strength for rowing and bailing water? Navigational knowledge? Medical skills? Emotional stability to maintain morale? Leadership ability to coordinate group efforts? Each criterion privileges different people and different conceptions of value. Age-based selection has intuitive appeal: save the young who have more life to live. But this reduces human worth to remaining lifespan, ignoring the depth of relationships, accumulated wisdom, and ongoing contributions that older people provide. Should a 20-year-old who has never worked take priority over a 50-year-old supporting 3 children? What about health status? Do we save healthy young people over sick young people? First come, first served might seem fair, but it rewards luck in reaching the lifeboat rather than any morally relevant characteristic. Need-based allocation could prioritize those who would suffer most from being excluded, perhaps those who cannot swim, but this might paradoxically punish those who took responsibility for developing survival skills. Economic approaches suggest we could hold an auction with lifeboat spots going to the highest bidders. This would reflect people's own valuations of their lives and their ability to compensate others for giving up spots. But it would also mean that survival depends purely on wealth, a criterion that seems morally arbitrary in life or death situations. Some might argue that no one should be forced overboard, that everyone should share the risk of sinking rather than guarantee some people's deaths. But this position, while emotionally appealing, might increase the probability that everyone dies. If there's a 90% chance everyone survives by sacrificing 5 people versus a 50% chance everyone dies by staying together, is the egalitarian approach really more ethical? The dilemma becomes more complex when we consider consent and voluntary sacrifice. What if people volunteer to go overboard? Should we accept their sacrifice, or does society have obligations to prevent people from giving up their lives even willingly? What if someone volunteers because they feel guilty about taking up space, or because they've been pressured by others? Can consent be truly free in such desperate circumstances? Real-world lifeboat scenarios have produced varied outcomes. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 led to women and children first protocols that saved proportionally more lives from higher social classes who had better access to lifeboats. The 1820 sinking of the Essex, which inspired Moby Dick, led to survivors drawing lots to determine who would be killed and eaten by the others. The 1884 case of Regina versus Dudley and Stevens saw British sailors convicted of murder for killing and eating their cabin boy, despite arguing necessity as defense. These historical cases reveal how survival situations strip away social conventions and legal niceties, forcing people to make decisions based on more fundamental moral intuitions. They also show how society later judges these decisions, often more harshly than the participants judged themselves at the time. The lifeboat dilemma applies beyond maritime disasters to many resource allocation problems. Hospital emergency rooms must decide which patients receive priority when resources are limited. During organ transplant allocation, committees determine who receives scarce organs based on medical need, likelihood of success, time on waiting lists, and other factors. Disaster relief efforts must choose which victims to help first when aid workers and supplies are insufficient for everyone. International aid presents large-scale lifeboat dilemmas. If wealthy nations cannot help everyone living in poverty, how should they choose which countries or populations to prioritize? Geographic proximity? Strategic importance? Cultural similarity? Greatest need? Highest likelihood of aid effectiveness? Each criterion embodies different values and leads to different allocation decisions. Climate change intensifies these dilemmas as rising seas literally create more lifeboats, islands and coastal areas that may become uninhabitable, forcing populations to seek refuge in areas with limited capacity. Should nations accept climate refugees proportional to their historical contributions to climate change? Their current wealth? Their geographic proximity to affected areas? Their cultural ties to refugee populations? The COVID-19 pandemic brought lifeboat ethics into stark relief as hospitals faced ventilator shortages, forcing decisions about which patients received life support. Age, health status, likelihood of survival, and potential years of life saved all figured into these tragic calculations. Some healthcare systems prepared lottery systems to avoid having individual doctors make selection decisions. Others used committee approaches to distribute responsibility. As sleep approaches and the conscious mind releases its grip on waking concerns, the lifeboat drifts through darker waters. We are all passengers on spaceship Earth, facing resource limitations that may someday force similar impossible choices. The boat rocks gently with each wave, and the question remains: when survival is at stake, what makes one life more valuable than another? And who among us has the moral authority to decide? The veil of ignorance, Rawls, Designing a Just Society. Imagine you could design society from scratch, but with one crucial constraint: you wouldn't know your place in it. Behind this veil of ignorance, you wouldn't know if you'd be rich or poor, male or female, able-bodied or disabled, brilliant or ordinary, religious or secular. What kind of society would you create if you might end up anywhere within it? This thought experiment, developed by philosopher John Rawls in his groundbreaking 1971 work, A Theory of Justice, offers a powerful tool for thinking about fairness and social organization. Rawls argued that the veil of ignorance eliminates the biases that typically corrupt our thinking about justice. We can't design institutions to benefit ourselves because we don't know who we'll be. From this original position, Rawls predicted, rational people would choose two fundamental principles. First, each person should have equal rights to basic liberties: freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and political participation. Second, social and economic inequalities should be arranged to benefit the least advantaged members of society, and positions should be open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. The logic seems compelling. If you might be born into any social position, you'd want to ensure that even the worst-off positions are as good as possible. You wouldn't choose a society where the poor live in misery, because you might be one of them. You wouldn't choose a system with rigid class barriers, because you might be born on the wrong side of them. Self-interest, filtered through ignorance of your particular interests, points toward justice. But the veil of ignorance raises uncomfortable questions about the societies we actually inhabit. Most of us know our social position, our race, gender, class, nationality, abilities, and circumstances. We know which policies would benefit us personally and which would cost us. Can we really set aside this knowledge and reason impartially about justice? Or do we inevitably rationalize positions that serve our interests while convincing ourselves we're being objective? Consider how the veil might apply to specific policy debates. Behind the veil, would you choose universal health care, not knowing if you'd be healthy or sick, rich or poor, employed or unemployed? What about progressive taxation? Would you support higher taxes on the wealthy if you might end up wealthy yourself, but also if you might end up needing the social services those taxes fund? What about affirmative action policies? How would they look if you didn't know your race or the historical advantages or disadvantages it might carry? The thought experiment becomes more complex when we consider what kinds of knowledge the veil should hide. Rawls specified that people behind the veil know general facts about human psychology, economics, and social organization, but not their particular circumstances. They know that people need food, shelter, and health care, but not whether they personally will be healthy or sick. They understand that education affects life outcomes, but not whether they'll be academically gifted. Critics argue that this level of abstraction is impossible or meaningless. How can we reason about justice without knowing what we value, what kind of life we want to lead, what trade-offs we're willing to make? If the veil hides our deepest commitments and convictions, are the people behind it really us, in any meaningful sense, or are they blank theoretical constructs? Religious believers might argue that the veil inappropriately excludes spiritual considerations. If you believe certain religious truths are objective facts, shouldn't a just society reflect those truths regardless of what people would choose from ignorance? Conversely, secular critics might argue that the veil doesn't go far enough in abstracting from particular religious and cultural commitments that bias our thinking about justice. The veil also raises questions about risk tolerance. Rawls assumed people behind the veil would be risk-averse, choosing to maximize the minimum possible outcome, the Maximin strategy. But some people might be natural risk-takers, willing to gamble on ending up in advantaged positions even if that means worse outcomes for the disadvantaged. Should social institutions reflect average risk preferences, or should they protect the risk-averse from the choices of risk-seekers? Practical applications of the veil of ignorance appear throughout political philosophy and policy analysis. Constitutional conventions sometimes approximate the original position, as delegates design institutions without knowing exactly how future political developments will affect their particular interests. International bodies like the United Nations attempt to create frameworks that serve all nations' interests without knowing which nations will be most powerful in the future. The veil also illuminates intergenerational justice dilemmas. If you didn't know which generation you'd be born into, how much should earlier generations sacrifice for later ones? Climate change policies look different if you might be born in 1950 or 2050, reaping the benefits of industrialization or bearing the costs of environmental degradation. Future generations have no voice in current political processes, but the veil of ignorance suggests we should consider their interests as if they were our own. Immigration policy presents another application. If you didn't know which country you'd be born in, would you support open borders, restrictive immigration policies, or something in between? The global distribution of wealth and opportunity looks different when viewed from behind a veil that hides nationality as well as individual circumstances. Some philosophers have proposed extending the veil to hide species membership. If you didn't know whether you'd be born human or non-human animal, what protections would you want for animal welfare? This radical extension challenges anthropocentric assumptions about moral consideration and might justify much stronger animal rights than most societies currently recognize. The veil of ignorance also applies to personal relationships and decisions. Before choosing a romantic partner, you might ask what kind of relationship you'd want if you didn't know which role you'd play, breadwinner or homemaker, dominant or subordinate, more or less attractive. Before having children, you might consider what kind of parent-child relationship you'd design if you didn't know whether you'd be the parent or the child. Technology creates new applications for the veil. If you were designing AI systems but didn't know whether you'd be a user, programmer, or subject of algorithmic decisions, what protections and rights would you build in? If you were designing social media platforms but didn't know whether you'd be a content creator, moderator, or ordinary user, what rules would you establish? Rawls himself acknowledged that the veil of ignorance is a device of representation, not a practical method for making political decisions. We can't actually forget who we are or what we care about. But the thought experiment can help us identify when our moral judgments might be distorted by self-interest and challenge us to consider perspectives different from our own. As consciousness dims and the veil of sleep approaches, perhaps we approximate something like Rawls's original position. In dreams, we might inhabit any identity, face any circumstances, live any life. The veil of ignorance reminds us that the accident of our birth circumstances, our talents, opportunities, and social positions, don't make us morally deserving of advantages or disadvantages. Justice requires designing institutions as if we might wake up tomorrow as anyone at all. The paradox of tolerance, tolerating intolerance. A democratic society prides itself on tolerance, accepting diverse viewpoints, protecting minority rights, and maintaining open dialogue across differences. But what happens when some members of that society advocate intolerance itself? Should a tolerant society tolerate those who would destroy tolerance? This paradox cuts to the heart of liberal democracy's deepest contradictions. Philosopher Karl Popper articulated this dilemma most clearly in his 1945 work, The Open Society and Its Enemies. He argued that unlimited tolerance leads to the disappearance of tolerance itself. If we tolerate those who are intolerant, we enable them to eliminate the tolerant, and with them, tolerance. Therefore, he concluded, we should not tolerate the intolerant, but only when they resort to violence or incitement rather than rational argument. The paradox seems abstract until we encounter its real-world manifestations. Should universities provide platforms for speakers who advocate racial superiority? Should social media companies allow hate speech? Should democratic societies permit political parties that would abolish democracy if they gain power? Each question forces us to choose between competing values: free expression versus protection from harm, openness versus security, procedural fairness versus substantive equality. Consider how this paradox played out in Weimar Germany. The democratic constitution protected the rights of all political parties, including the Nazi Party, to organize, speak, and compete for power. This tolerance for anti-democratic forces ultimately enabled them to capture democratic institutions and destroy democracy from within. The lesson seems clear. Tolerance that enables its own destruction isn't tolerance at all, it's suicide. But drawing lines around tolerance proves treacherous. Who decides what counts as intolerance? By what criteria? And what responses are justified? If we silence intolerant voices, do we become intolerant ourselves? If we deny platforms to those who would deny platforms to others, are we protecting tolerance or undermining it? The paradox deepens when we consider that most people are intolerant of something. Few truly tolerate child abuse, violence, or fraud. We all draw lines somewhere, marking certain behaviors as unacceptable regardless of their practitioners' sincere beliefs. The question isn't whether to be intolerant of anything, but where to draw the lines and how to justify them. Religious tolerance illustrates the complexity. Should a tolerant society accept practices like female genital mutilation, honor killings, or forced marriage when they're justified on religious grounds? Should it tolerate religious groups that discriminate against women, LGBTQ+ individuals, or religious minorities? The collision between tolerance for religious diversity and protection of individual rights creates seemingly irreconcilable tensions. Modern debates about cancel culture reflect the paradox in new forms. When universities disinvite controversial speakers or social media users face consequences for offensive posts, critics argue that tolerance is being abandoned in favor of conformity. But defenders contend that true tolerance requires protecting vulnerable groups from harassment and exclusion, even if that means limiting some forms of expression. The temporal dimension adds another layer of complexity. Tolerance that seems excessive in peaceful times might seem insufficient during crises. Democratic societies often restrict civil liberties during wartime, justifying temporary intolerance as necessary to preserve long-term tolerance. But emergency measures have a way of becoming permanent, and the definition of crisis tends to expand over time. Legal systems struggle with these tensions through doctrines like clear and present danger or imminent lawless action that attempt to distinguish protected speech from unprotected incitement. But these standards require judgment calls about probability and timing that different observers assess differently. What looks like dangerous incitement to one person appears as legitimate political advocacy to another. The international dimension complicates matters further. Should tolerant societies tolerate intolerant regimes? Should they engage diplomatically with governments that suppress their own people, or does such engagement enable oppression? Should they accept immigrants from intolerant societies who might not share liberal values? Each choice involves trade-offs between principles and practical consequences. Consider how technology amplifies the paradox. Social media platforms must decide whether to host content that advocates intolerance, knowing that their algorithms might amplify such content to massive audiences. Traditional free speech principles developed for face-to-face discourse or print media may not translate well to digital environments where harmful content can spread instantly and globally. The paradox also appears in educational contexts. Should schools teach students about intolerant ideologies like Nazism or fundamentalism? Such education might help students recognize and resist intolerance, but it might also legitimize intolerant ideas by presenting them as worthy of serious consideration. How do we maintain intellectual openness while avoiding false equivalence between tolerant and intolerant positions? Psychological research suggests that exposure to intolerant ideas doesn't necessarily increase support for them, and might sometimes decrease it by revealing their logical and moral flaws. But this research typically involves controlled, educational contexts rather than the chaotic information environment of contemporary media. The effects of exposure might depend critically on context, presentation, and audience characteristics. Some philosophers argue that the paradox rests on a confusion between tolerance as an attitude and tolerance as a political principle. As individuals, we needn't have positive attitudes toward intolerant ideas. We can reject them, criticize them, and work to counter them. But as citizens in democratic societies, we might still support legal protections for intolerant expression, believing that the alternative, government-enforced speech codes, poses greater dangers to freedom. Others contend that tolerance properly understood never required accepting everything equally. Tolerance might mean accepting that different people will hold different views while still maintaining that some views are better than others. We can tolerate racists by not persecuting them legally while still treating racism as morally unacceptable and socially unwelcome. The paradox intersects with debates about moral relativism. If we believe that tolerance itself is just one value among many, with no special claim to universality, then intolerant societies might be perfectly justified in rejecting it. But if we believe tolerance reflects universal human rights or rational principles, then we have grounds for being intolerant of intolerance regardless of cultural differences. Historical examples provide both cautionary tales and grounds for optimism. While Weimar Germany shows how tolerance can be exploited by its enemies, other societies have successfully maintained tolerance despite significant internal challenges. The United States weathered the civil rights era's conflicts over racial equality, emerging more rather than less tolerant. Many European societies have integrated diverse immigrant populations while maintaining liberal democratic institutions. As consciousness fades and sleep approaches, the paradox of tolerance reveals itself as more than an academic puzzle. It's a daily challenge facing everyone who must decide how to respond to ideas and behaviors they find objectionable. Do we engage with intolerant viewpoints, hoping to change minds through dialogue? Do we ignore them, hoping they'll fade without attention? Do we actively oppose them, risking the accusation that we've become intolerant ourselves? The questions multiply in the twilight space between certainty and doubt, where the boundaries of tolerance become as fluid as the boundaries of waking thought. Dirty Hands Problem: doing bad for good outcomes? The rebel leader sits across from you, calmly explaining that he has planted bombs throughout the city that will kill thousands of innocent people unless you torture his captured lieutenant for the disarming codes. You have 1 hour. Your hands are clean now, but in 60 minutes, they will be stained either with the blood of one tortured prisoner or thousands of dead civilians. There is no third option, no clever escape from the moral trap. What do you choose? This scenario captures what philosophers call the dirty hands problem. Situations where doing the right thing seems to require doing something wrong. The term comes from Jean-Paul Sartre's play of the same name, but the concept has ancient roots in political philosophy. Niccolò Machiavelli argued that effective rulers must sometimes act immorally for the greater good. Max Weber distinguished between an ethics of conviction, that maintains moral purity, and an ethics of responsibility, that accepts moral compromise to achieve beneficial outcomes. The dirty hands problem appears wherever the stakes are high and the options are limited. Politicians promise transparency during campaigns, then discover that governing sometimes requires secrecy. Military leaders must send soldiers to their deaths to protect civilian populations. Prosecutors might need to make deals with criminals to catch more dangerous ones. Doctors might have to cause pain to prevent greater suffering. Parents might need to lie to children to protect them from traumatic truths. What makes these situations particularly torturous is that they seem to pit moral requirements against each other. If you torture the lieutenant, you violate the categorical prohibition against using people as mere means to an end, treating them as objects rather than persons with inherent dignity. But if you don't torture him, you allow thousands of innocent people to die when you could have prevented their deaths. Either choice violates fundamental moral principles. Some moral theories attempt to dissolve the problem by denying that genuine moral dilemmas exist. Act utilitarianism suggests that you should simply calculate which action produces the best overall consequences. Torturing one person to save thousands is clearly justified on utilitarian grounds. The mathematics of suffering favor the many over the one. From this perspective, there's no real dilemma, just a difficult calculation. But this utilitarian solution strikes many people as inadequate. It seems to miss something important about the wrongness of torture, reducing human dignity to a variable in a cost-benefit analysis. Even if torture is justified in extreme circumstances, shouldn't we feel guilty about it? Shouldn't we recognize that we've done something terrible, even if it was necessary? Deontological ethics, following Immanuel Kant, suggests that some actions are wrong regardless of consequences. Torture violates human dignity by treating people as mere tools, and no amount of good consequences can justify such treatment. From this perspective, you should refuse to torture the lieutenant even if it means allowing thousands to die. Your moral integrity requires accepting the worst outcome rather than participating in evil yourself. But this deontological purity comes at a steep price. Can it really be more moral to let thousands die than to dirty your own hands? Is moral purity worth mass casualties? Critics argue that such rigidity represents moral cowardice, a selfish concern for one's own moral status that ignores consequences for others. Some philosophers embrace the tragic nature of dirty hands situations. They argue that moral dilemmas can be genuine, that we sometimes face choices where every option violates important moral requirements. In such cases, we should choose the lesser evil while recognizing that it remains evil. The person who tortures to save thousands should feel guilty, seek forgiveness, and perhaps face punishment even though their action was justified. This remainder view suggests that moral wrongdoing leaves traces even when it's justified. The politician who lies for good reasons has still lied. The general who sacrifices soldiers for strategic advantage has still caused deaths. These actions may be necessary, but they're not morally neutral. They extract a price from both their victims and their perpetrators. Real-world examples of the dirty hands problem abound throughout history and contemporary politics. During World War II, Allied leaders faced decisions about bombing civilian targets, working with unsavory allies like Stalin, and prioritizing some victims over others with limited resources. The development of atomic weapons presented the ultimate dirty hands dilemma, creating and potentially using weapons of unprecedented destructive power to end a devastating war. Intelligence agencies routinely face dirty hands problems. Should they recruit informants through blackmail? Should they cooperate with authoritarian regimes to gain access to terrorist networks? Should they conduct surveillance on their own citizens to prevent attacks? Each choice involves moral compromise in service of security objectives. Medical ethics presents more intimate versions of the problem. Should doctors lie to patients about terminal diagnoses if the truth might hasten their deaths? Should they prescribe placebos if deception increases treatment effectiveness? Should they allocate scarce resources based on social value judgments about patients' lives? Should they participate in interrogations if their medical knowledge might help extract information that saves lives? The COVID-19 pandemic created numerous dirty hands dilemmas. Public health officials had to decide whether to recommend against mask wearing early in the pandemic to preserve supplies for healthcare workers, knowing this might increase community transmission. Politicians had to weigh economic shutdowns against disease spread, accepting that either choice would cause suffering and death. Environmental policy presents large-scale dirty hands problems. Should societies accept some pollution and environmental degradation to lift people out of poverty? Should they prioritize immediate human needs over long-term ecological sustainability? Should they use carbon-intensive industries to fund renewable energy transitions? Each approach involves moral compromise. The problem becomes more complex when we consider long-term consequences and precedent effects. Even if torture is justified in extreme circumstances, does using it make future torture more likely? Does it coarsen society and erode moral constraints that usually prevent such abuses? The immediate calculation might favor torture, but the broader systemic effects might counsel against it. Cultural and contextual factors also matter. Actions that seem clearly wrong in peaceful, prosperous societies might be more defensible in desperate circumstances. The luxury of moral purity might itself depend on privilege. Only those insulated from harsh consequences can afford to keep their hands perfectly clean. Some critics argue that dirty hands scenarios are often artificial, designed to force false choices between extreme options. They suggest that creative problem-solving can usually find alternatives that avoid moral compromise. But this optimism might reflect naive faith in human ingenuity rather than realistic assessment of moral constraints. The psychological toll of dirty hands decisions complicates the moral analysis. People who make such choices often suffer lasting trauma, guilt, and moral injury. Should this suffering be considered part of the moral equation? Does it represent appropriate punishment for moral wrongdoing, or unfortunate collateral damage from necessary decisions? As sleep approaches and moral certainties fade into ambiguity, the dirty hands problem reveals the tragic dimension of human choice. We live in a world where good intentions collide with harsh realities, where moral principles conflict with practical necessities, where clean hands might come at the cost of others' lives. The rebel leader's ultimatum echoes through countless smaller choices. Every time we must choose between competing obligations, every time we must act without perfect information, every time we must accept responsibility for outcomes we cannot fully control. In the space between waking judgment and sleeping innocence, our hands bear the stains of all the compromises that moral life requires. Moral luck, outcomes affecting moral judgment. Two equally reckless drivers speed through a school zone at the same excessive speed, with the same disregard for safety, harboring the same selfish indifference to others' well-being. But only one strikes and kills a child who unexpectedly runs into the street. Both drivers acted identically, yet we judge them differently. One faces moral condemnation and legal punishment for vehicular manslaughter. The other receives a traffic ticket. Their moral culpability was identical, but luck determined their moral standing. How can this be just? This puzzle, articulated by philosopher Bernard Williams and developed by Thomas Nagel, reveals how factors beyond our control shape moral judgment in ways that seem to undermine the very concept of moral responsibility. If we're only responsible for what we can control, and luck influences so much of what happens, how much moral responsibility can anyone truly bear? Nagel identified 4 types of moral luck that complicate our assessments of praise and blame. Constitutive luck refers to our character, temperament, and capabilities, traits largely shaped by genetics, upbringing, and circumstances beyond our control. Circumstantial luck involves the situations we encounter, whether we face moral tests or live quiet lives where our character flaws never emerge. Antecedent luck encompasses the causal history that leads to our actions, all the influences and experiences that shape our choices. Finally, consequent luck concerns outcomes that follow from our actions but depend on factors we cannot predict or control. Consider constitutive luck first. People don't choose their genes, their early childhood experiences, or the neural patterns that shape their personalities. Someone born with strong empathetic responses and good impulse control has advantages in moral behavior that others lack through no fault of their own. Is it fair to praise the naturally empathetic person more than someone who struggles against selfish impulses? Should we condemn the person whose brain chemistry predisposes them to aggression more than someone blessed with a calm temperament? The implications extend to criminal justice. If brain scans reveal that violent criminals have abnormal neural structures, does this mitigate their moral responsibility? Recent neuroscience suggests that psychopaths lack normal emotional responses to others' suffering. They're literally unable to experience empathy in typical ways. If their harmful behavior stems from biological deficits they didn't choose, how can we hold them fully responsible? Circumstantial luck raises equally troubling questions. Many people who consider themselves moral have simply never faced severe temptation or desperate circumstances. Would the honest shopkeeper remain honest if their children were starving? Would the law-abiding citizen obey unjust laws under totalitarian rule? We can't know our true moral character until it's tested, and whether it gets tested depends largely on luck. Historical examples illuminate this problem. Many Germans who became Nazi collaborators might have been decent people in different circumstances, while many who showed heroic resistance might have been cowards in different situations. The Stanford prison experiment suggested that ordinary people can become abusive when placed in certain roles and environments. If situation shapes behavior so powerfully, what does individual moral responsibility mean? Antecedent luck challenges the notion that we're the ultimate authors of our actions. Every choice emerges from a complex web of prior influences, genetic predispositions, childhood experiences, cultural conditioning, immediate circumstances. We make decisions based on values and reasoning processes we didn't ultimately choose. If we trace the causal chain back far enough, do we ever reach a point where we're truly responsible? This line of thinking leads toward hard determinism, the view that free will is an illusion and moral responsibility is therefore impossible. If our actions are the inevitable result of prior causes, praise and blame make no more sense than thanking a calculator for correct arithmetic or condemning a storm for property damage. Consequent luck may be the most counterintuitive form. We routinely judge actions partly by their outcomes, even when those outcomes were unforeseeable. The drunk driver who makes it home safely faces different moral judgment than one who kills someone, despite identical behavior. The person who donates to what turns out to be a fraudulent charity faces different assessment than one whose donation genuinely helps people. Professional contexts highlight consequent luck regularly. Two surgeons perform identical operations with identical skill and care, but one patient dies due to an unforeseeable allergic reaction while the other recovers completely. Should we judge the surgeon's performance differently? Two investment advisors give identical advice based on identical analysis, but market events beyond their control make one client rich and the other poor. How do we separate skill from luck in assessing their professional competence? The legal system struggles with moral luck constantly. Attempted murder typically receives lighter punishment than successful murder, even when the only difference is factors beyond the perpetrator's control, whether the victim received prompt medical care, whether their injuries hit vital organs, whether they had underlying health conditions. This suggests that legal responsibility tracks actual outcomes, not just intentions and efforts. Some philosophers argue that moral luck shows the incoherence of ordinary moral concepts. If responsibility requires control and we control very little, then perhaps we should abandon praise and blame entirely in favor of a more therapeutic or consequentialist approach focused on preventing harmful behavior rather than punishing it. Others contend that moral luck is compatible with responsibility properly understood. They argue that responsibility doesn't require ultimate control over outcomes, just reasonable control over our actions given our circumstances. We can be responsible for our choices while acknowledging that factors beyond our control influence both our character and our situation. The problem of moral luck also intersects with questions about collective responsibility. Are citizens responsible for their government's actions? Are members of groups responsible for other members' behavior? Are people living today responsible for historical injustices committed by their ancestors? Each question involves complex interactions between individual agency and circumstances beyond personal control. Consider how moral luck affects interpersonal relationships. We judge friends and romantic partners partly based on how they treat us, but their behavior toward us depends partly on our own actions and on circumstances neither of us controls. The friend who stands by you during crisis might abandon someone else facing different challenges. The partner who seems devoted might behave differently under stress you haven't yet encountered together. Moral luck also operates at the level of moral progress. People who hold enlightened views today often benefit from social movements and intellectual developments they didn't create. Someone born into a society that has already rejected slavery receives no special credit for opposing slavery compared to someone who courageously opposed it when such opposition was dangerous and unpopular. The recognition of moral luck might cultivate humility about our own moral standing. If circumstances and constitutive factors beyond our control significantly influence our behavior, we might be more forgiving of others' failures and less proud of our own successes. This could lead to more compassionate approaches to criminal justice, education, and social policy. But excessive focus on moral luck might also undermine moral motivation. If outcomes depend largely on factors beyond our control, why make moral effort? If praise and blame are unfair, why try to be good? The recognition of moral luck must be balanced against the practical need for accountability and motivation. Some suggest that moral luck points toward virtue ethics rather than act-based approaches. Instead of focusing on specific actions and their outcomes, we might emphasize character development and moral education. While we can't control our constitutive endowments entirely, we might be able to shape our character through practice and reflection, accepting responsibility for becoming the kinds of people who act well when circumstances permit. As consciousness dims and the boundary between choice and chance becomes increasingly blurred, moral luck reveals the precarious nature of all moral judgment. We praise and blame, assign credit and fault, distinguish heroes from villains, but the foundations of these distinctions rest partly on factors as arbitrary as the weather. In the twilight between sleeping and waking, when intention and outcome drift apart like fragments of a dissolving dream, we might glimpse the humbling truth that moral responsibility is both necessary and impossible, both meaningful and arbitrary, a paradox as deep as consciousness itself. Thomson's Violinist, Abortion Ethics Analogy. You wake up in a hospital bed, connected by tubes to an unconscious man lying beside you. A representative from the Society of Music Lovers explains that you've been kidnapped because you alone have the rare blood type needed to keep this famous violinist alive. He has a fatal kidney ailment, and your circulatory system must filter his blood for 9 months until his kidneys recover. Disconnecting yourself will kill him, but you never consented to this arrangement. Do you have the right to unplug yourself, even though doing so will cause his death? Philosopher Judith Jarvis Thomson introduced this thought experiment in her influential 1971 essay, A Defense of Abortion, to illuminate the moral complexities surrounding reproductive choice. Even if we grant that the fetus has a right to life, a significant concession, it doesn't automatically follow that abortion is impermissible. Rights can conflict, and the right to life doesn't necessarily trump all other rights, including the right to bodily autonomy. The violinist analogy challenges the common anti-abortion argument that goes, the fetus is a person, persons have a right to life, therefore abortion is murder. Thomson accepts the first two premises but argues that the conclusion doesn't follow. Even if the fetus is a person with a right to life, the pregnant woman also has rights, particularly the right to decide what happens to her own body. When rights conflict, we need more nuanced analysis than simple assertions about the sanctity of life. In the violinist case, most people intuitively feel that you have the right to disconnect yourself, despite the fact that doing so will kill an innocent person. This suggests that the right to bodily autonomy can sometimes outweigh another person's right to life, especially when that person's dependence on your body was established without your consent. But the analogy isn't perfect, and its limitations reveal important moral complexities. In typical pregnancy cases, setting aside rape, the woman's actions contributed to creating the situation where the fetus depends on her body. This might generate special obligations that don't exist in the violinist scenario, where you bear no responsibility for the musician's condition or dependence. Consider how responsibility affects moral obligation. If you negligently cause a car accident that injures someone, you might have special duties to help them that wouldn't apply to randomly encountered strangers. Similarly, if pregnancy results from voluntary sexual activity, some argue that this creates special obligations to the resulting fetus that go beyond general duties to strangers. Thomson anticipates this objection with additional analogies. Suppose you open a window in your house and a burglar climbs in. Even though your action, opening the window, enabled the intrusion, the burglar doesn't acquire rights to remain in your house. Or imagine that people's seeds drift through the air, and despite installing screens on your windows, one occasionally gets through and takes root in your carpet. Does the resulting person-plant have a right to remain in your house? These analogies attempt to capture cases where someone takes reasonable precautions against pregnancy, using contraception, but becomes pregnant anyway. If contraception fails despite proper use, Thomson suggests, the resulting fetus doesn't necessarily acquire rights to use the woman's body, just as the accidentally admitted people's seed doesn't acquire property rights in your house. Critics argue that these analogies distort the moral relationship between parent and child. Pregnancy isn't like hosting an unwanted intruder, it's the natural biological process through which new human life develops. The fetus isn't a stranger who happens to depend on the woman's body but her own offspring, created through her actions and bearing special claims on her care. The parent-child relationship seems to generate distinctive obligations that don't apply to strangers. Parents have duties to feed, shelter, and protect their children even when doing so requires significant sacrifice. If the fetus is already a child, why shouldn't these parental obligations apply during pregnancy as well as after birth? Thomson addresses this through what she calls the Good Samaritan distinction. She argues that while it might be indecent or callous for someone to disconnect from the violinist, it wouldn't be unjust. Similarly, while carrying an unwanted pregnancy to term might be a virtuous act of generosity, it shouldn't be legally required. The law should demand only that we refrain from violating others' rights, not that we go above and beyond to help them. This distinction between justice and virtue, between what we owe others and what would be admirable to give them, appears throughout moral philosophy. We don't legally require people to donate blood, even though doing so could save lives at minimal cost to donors. We don't compel kidney donations, even when someone will die without them and the donor could survive with one kidney. The violinist case suggests that pregnancy might fall into the same category, a case where helping would be virtuous but not obligatory. But the Good Samaritan analysis raises new questions about the limits of required assistance. How much sacrifice can society demand from individuals to help others? If a woman must carry a pregnancy to term to save fetal life, should everyone be required to donate blood regularly to save actual children's lives? Should we mandate organ donation after death to save multiple lives? The consistency principle cuts both ways. The temporally extended nature of pregnancy also complicates the analogy. The violinist scenario involves 9 months of inconvenience and some health risks, but pregnancy involves permanent physical changes, potential complications, and a lifetime connection to another person. Even if the woman gives up the child for adoption, she bears the physical and emotional costs of pregnancy and childbirth. Furthermore, pregnancy isn't just a matter of allowing someone to use your body, it involves active physical participation in creating and sustaining new life. The woman's body doesn't just host the fetus passively but actively nourishes and develops it through complex biological processes. This might generate stronger obligations than mere non-interference. Thomson's argument also depends heavily on the assumption that the fetus has a right to life equivalent to that of born persons. But this assumption remains contested. If the fetus lacks the cognitive capacities, social relationships, or self-awareness that typically ground rights to life, then the entire framework changes. The violinist analogy might be irrelevant if there's no rights bearer to consider. Different stages of pregnancy raise different moral questions. A first trimester fetus differs dramatically from a third trimester fetus in terms of development, viability, and resemblance to born persons. The violinist analogy might apply differently across different stages, with stronger obligations emerging as the fetus develops greater personhood-relevant capacities. The analogy also struggles with cases involving fetal abnormalities. If prenatal testing reveals that the fetus has severe developmental disabilities that will cause suffering and early death, does this change the moral calculation? The violinist scenario typically assumes that the dependent person will recover and go on to live a normal life, but pregnancy sometimes involves carrying a fetus that will never develop normally. Cultural and religious perspectives add further complexity. Many religious traditions view pregnancy as involving sacred responsibilities that transcend individual choice. From these perspectives, the violinist analogy might miss essential spiritual dimensions of pregnancy and parenthood that purely secular rights-based analysis cannot capture. Legal applications of Thomson's argument have been influential but controversial. The bodily autonomy framework appears in various court decisions about reproductive rights, but so do competing frameworks emphasizing fetal rights, state interests in protecting potential life, and the distinctive nature of the parent-child relationship. As sleep approaches and the boundaries between self and other become increasingly fluid, Thomson's violinist plays on. The tubes connecting bodies, the responsibilities we bear for others' dependence on us, the rights we claim over our own flesh, all blend into the complex moral landscape where individual autonomy meets interpersonal obligation. In dreams, we might find ourselves connected to countless others, sustaining them through our very existence, unable to determine where our duties end and our freedom begins. The violinist's melody continues, and we must choose whether to keep playing our part. The Repugnant Conclusion, Parfit Population Ethics. Imagine 2 possible futures for humanity. In the first, 10 billion people live excellent lives filled with happiness, fulfillment, and meaning. lives so wonderful that everyone would gladly choose to exist. In the second future, 1 trillion people exist, but their lives are barely worth living, not miserable enough to prefer non-existence, but containing only the slightest margin of satisfaction over suffering. Which world would be better? Most people intuitively prefer the first world, 10 billion flourishing lives over 1 trillion barely tolerable ones. But philosopher Derek Parfit demonstrated that this intuition leads to what he called the repugnant conclusion. For any population of people living excellent lives, there exists a larger population living lives barely worth living that would be better according to utilitarian logic. The mathematics of total happiness favor quantity over quality when the numbers get large enough. This paradox strikes at the heart of how we think about progress, policy, and the future of humanity. If we accept total utilitarianism, the view that we should maximize the sum of well-being across all people, then we might be obligated to choose population policies that create vast numbers of people with mediocre lives rather than smaller numbers with excellent ones. The reasoning seems inexorable. Suppose each person in the excellent world has 100 units of well-being, giving a total of 1 trillion units across 10 billion people. Now imagine a world with 100 trillion people, each with 11 units of well-being, just barely above the threshold where life is worth living. This world contains 1.1 trillion units of total well-being, vastly exceeding the excellent world despite each individual life being nearly worthless. Parfit found this conclusion repugnant because it suggests that we should prefer worlds filled with lives barely worth living to worlds filled with excellent lives, as long as there are enough of the former. It seems to imply that we should focus on creating more people rather than making existing people better off, and that we should aim for quantity of life rather than quality. The implications extend far beyond abstract philosophy into practical policy questions. Should developing countries focus on economic growth that lifts their current populations out of poverty, or on population growth that brings more people into existence even if they remain poor? Should wealthy countries prioritize improving their citizens' already good lives, or helping more people in other countries achieve basic subsistence levels? Environmental policy faces similar trade-offs. Should we limit population growth to preserve higher living standards and environmental quality for fewer people, or accept environmental degradation and lower living standards in order to support larger populations? Climate change mitigation might prevent future generations from existing at all, while climate change adaptation might allow larger but worse-off future populations. The repugnant conclusion also applies to technological and medical decisions. Should we develop life extension technologies that allow existing people to live longer, better lives, or focus on preventing infant mortality and increasing fertility rates to bring more people into existence? Should we cure diseases that cause suffering or prevent diseases that cause early death, thereby allowing more total person years of life? One response to Parfit's paradox involves rejecting total utilitarianism in favor of average utilitarianism, judging worlds by the average well-being of their inhabitants rather than the total. Under this approach, the world with 10 billion excellent lives clearly beats the world with 1 trillion barely tolerable ones, since 100 units of average well-being exceeds 11 units. But average utilitarianism generates its own counterintuitive implications. It suggests that we could improve the world by killing off the worst-off people, thereby raising the average. It also implies that we shouldn't help people whose well-being is below average, since doing so, assuming we can't raise them all the way to average, would lower the overall average. Most troublingly, it might recommend preventing the births of people who would have good but below average lives. Priority-weighted approaches attempt to split the difference by giving extra moral weight to improvements in the well-being of worse-off people. This makes total well-being depend not just on the sum of individual welfare but on how that welfare is distributed. But these approaches face technical challenges in specifying exactly how much extra weight to give to the worse-off, and they can still generate repugnant conclusions in extreme cases. Some philosophers reject the entire framework by arguing that lives can't be compared across different numbers of people. They contend that better than relations only make sense within fixed populations, not across populations of different sizes. This incomparability approach avoids the repugnant conclusion by denying that we can meaningfully compare worlds with different numbers of people. But incomparability seems to paralyze practical decision-making. Policy choices routinely affect both the number of future people and their well-being. Immigration policies, environmental regulations, healthcare spending, and educational investments all influence population size and individual welfare. If we can't compare outcomes across different population sizes, how can we make these decisions rationally? The temporal dimension adds further complexity. Should we care about the total number of person years lived throughout history, or focus on peak population levels at particular times? Should we discount future well-being, giving less weight to the welfare of distant generations? Should we consider potential people who might exist under different policy choices, or only actual people who will definitely exist? Religious and secular perspectives on the value of existence diverge sharply on these questions. Many religious traditions view existence itself as a gift and see the creation of new life as intrinsically valuable. From these perspectives, bringing people into existence might be good even if their lives are only marginally worth living. Secular approaches might be more skeptical about the value of existence per se, focusing instead on the quality of experiences within existing lives. The repugnant conclusion also connects to debates about procreative ethics and parental responsibilities. If potential parents can choose between having one child who will live an excellent life or 3 children who will live decent but less excellent lives, which choice is better? Should family-size decisions consider only the welfare of potential children, or also their impact on existing family members and society? Intergenerational justice raises related questions. Do we owe future generations the highest possible quality of life, or the largest possible number of lives worth living? Should current environmental sacrifices aim to ensure that future people live excellently, or to ensure that more future people exist even if they live less well? Population growth patterns in the developing world present these dilemmas concretely. Many poor countries have high birth rates despite low living standards. Is this tragic because children are born into difficult circumstances, or valuable because more people get to experience existence despite its challenges? Should international aid focus on reducing birth rates or improving living conditions for larger populations? The repugnant conclusion might also apply to non-human animals. If we accept that animal welfare matters morally, should we prefer a world with fewer wild animals living excellent lives, or more animals living lives barely worth living? Wildlife conservation efforts must balance population sizes against individual animal welfare, especially when managing habitats that can support different numbers of animals at different welfare levels. Technology companies face related trade-offs when designing platforms and services. Should social media algorithms optimize for maximum engagement across the largest possible user base, even if this creates addictive but barely positive experiences? Or should they focus on creating deeply meaningful experiences for smaller numbers of users? The attention economy often seems to embrace quantity over quality, potentially implementing the repugnant conclusion in digital form. As sleep approaches and individual consciousness dissolves into the larger patterns of existence, the repugnant conclusion haunts the borderland between being and non-being. In dreams, we might glimpse infinite populations living lives of infinite variety, some flourishing beyond measure, others barely clinging to the edge of worthwhile existence. The mathematics of moral value continue their relentless calculation. 10 billion excellent dreams versus a trillion dreams barely worth having, the sum always growing, the average always falling, and the question remaining whether it's better to dream at all. The utility monster, utilitarianism challenge. Imagine a creature so uniquely designed that every pleasure it experiences is 1,000 times more intense than yours. Every bite of food, every moment of comfort, every sensation brings this being such overwhelming joy that your greatest happiness pales in comparison. This is the utility monster, and it presents one of the most challenging thought experiments in moral philosophy. The concept emerges from the heart of utilitarian ethics, the moral theory that judges actions based on their consequences, specifically how much happiness or pleasure they produce and how much suffering they prevent. According to classical utilitarianism, developed by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, the right action is always the one that maximizes overall well-being or utility for the greatest number of people. At first glance, this seems reasonable, even noble. Who wouldn't want to reduce suffering and increase happiness in the world? But the utility monster, first introduced by philosopher Robert Nozick in 1974, reveals a disturbing logical conclusion of this seemingly compassionate philosophy. Here's how the thought experiment works. If such a creature existed, one capable of experiencing vastly more pleasure than any human, then according to strict utilitarian logic, we would be morally obligated to sacrifice everything for its benefit. Every resource, every comfort, every pleasure that we might enjoy should instead be given to this monster, because it would derive so much more utility from these things than we ever could. Consider the mathematics of this moral calculus. If the monster experiences 1,000 units of pleasure from a meal that would give you only 1 unit, then feeding the monster instead of yourself produces 999 additional units of total happiness in the universe. Multiply this across every decision, every resource allocation, every moment of potential pleasure, and the conclusion becomes stark. Morality demands that humans become slaves to this creature's happiness. This isn't merely about luxury items or entertainment. The logic extends to basic necessities. Your food, your shelter, your medicine, all should go to the monster if it can derive greater pleasure from them. Even more unsettling, if the monster's pleasure is intense enough, it might be morally justified to cause you pain if that somehow contributed to the creature's greater joy. The implications ripple outward into disturbing territories. What if this monster required human suffering as part of its pleasure? What if it found the greatest joy in watching others experience pain? Traditional utilitarian calculus would suggest that if the monster's pleasure outweighed human suffering sufficiently, such arrangements would not only be acceptable but morally required. This thought experiment exposes what many philosophers see as a fundamental flaw in simple utilitarian thinking. It reduces human beings to mere vessels for producing and containing happiness, with no inherent dignity or worth beyond their capacity to generate utility. We become interchangeable units in a cosmic happiness calculation, valuable only insofar as we contribute to the total sum of pleasure in the universe. But the critique runs deeper than concerns about human dignity. The utility monster reveals how utilitarianism can justify extreme inequality if the beneficiary derives sufficiently intense pleasure from resources. In our real world, we might ask, do the ultra-wealthy experience proportionally greater pleasure from their resources? If a billionaire derives more satisfaction from their 100th luxury car than a homeless person would from basic shelter, does utilitarian logic demand we prioritize the billionaire's pleasure? The monster also challenges our intuitions about distributive justice. Most people feel that there's something inherently valuable about fairness, about ensuring that good things are distributed equitably rather than concentrated wherever they produce the most total utility. The utility monster suggests that utilitarianism might require us to abandon these fairness considerations entirely. Some philosophers have attempted to rescue utilitarianism from this critique. They argue that the scenario is too fantastical to be relevant, that no such creature could exist in reality. Others propose that the law of diminishing marginal utility, the idea that additional units of pleasure become less valuable as you already have more, would prevent such extreme concentrations of resources. Mill himself tried to address similar concerns by distinguishing between higher and lower pleasures, arguing that intellectual and moral pleasures are inherently more valuable than physical ones. Under this framework, human capacity for complex pleasures might protect us from being completely sacrificed to a creature that experiences only intense but simple gratifications. Modern preference utilitarians take a different approach, arguing that what matters isn't pleasure per se, but the satisfaction of preferences. Since most humans have strong preferences against being enslaved or sacrificed, these preferences would count against the monster's claims. But critics note that this merely shifts the problem. What if the monster has even stronger preferences for receiving everything? Rule utilitarians propose another escape route, suggesting that we should follow moral rules that generally produce the best outcomes, rather than calculating utilities case by case. They argue that a rule permitting slavery to utility monsters would have terrible consequences if widely adopted, even if it might seem beneficial in isolated cases. Yet each of these responses raises new questions. If we modify utilitarianism enough to avoid the utility monster problem, do we still have a coherent utilitarian theory? Or have we smuggled in other moral considerations, like fairness, dignity, or rights, that contradict the original utilitarian framework? The thought experiment also connects to contemporary debates about artificial intelligence and enhancement technologies. As we develop more sophisticated AI systems, should we create beings capable of experiencing vastly greater pleasure than humans? If we could enhance human capacity for happiness through genetic engineering or neural modification, would we be morally obligated to do so? And what would we owe to any beings, artificial or biological, whose capacity for experience exceeded our own? The utility monster forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the foundations of morality itself. Is maximizing total happiness really the ultimate goal of ethics? Or are there other values, human dignity, individual rights, fairness, authenticity, that matter independently of their contribution to overall utility? Perhaps most unsettling of all, The thought experiment suggests that our moral intuitions might be fundamentally at odds with the logical implications of seemingly reasonable moral principles. We want to reduce suffering and increase happiness, but we also recoil from the idea of sacrificing individual humans for the greater good, no matter how much greater that good might be. The utility monster lurks in the shadows of every utilitarian calculation, reminding us that even our most compassionate moral impulses can lead to conclusions that challenge our deepest convictions about human worth and dignity. In wrestling with this paradox, we're forced to examine not just what we believe about right and wrong, but why we believe it, and whether our moral frameworks can withstand the pressure of their own logical conclusions. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider this creature of infinite appetite for pleasure, and ask yourself, what makes a human life valuable? Is it our capacity for happiness, our dignity as rational beings, or something else entirely? The answer might determine whether we're moral agents deserving of respect or merely instruments in the universe's grand calculus of joy and suffering. Deontology versus consequentialism versus virtue ethics. 3 friends witness a car accident where the driver has fled the scene, leaving behind a briefcase containing $1 million in cash. The first friend says they must immediately turn it over to police because stealing is always wrong, regardless of consequences. The second argues they should keep it and donate to charity, since this action would produce the greatest good for the greatest number. The third suggests they consider what a virtuous person would do, focusing on developing their own moral character through this decision. Welcome to the eternal battlefield of moral philosophy, where 3 titans of ethical thought clash over the fundamental question: what makes an action right or wrong? Deontological ethics, derived from the Greek word deon meaning duty, stands as the fortress of moral absolutes. Immanuel Kant, its most famous architect, constructed a system where rightness and wrongness are determined not by outcomes, but by the inherent nature of actions themselves and the intentions behind them. According to Kant's categorical imperative, moral laws are universal commands that admit no exceptions. When Kant declared, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law," he created a moral framework that judges actions based on whether we could rationally desire everyone to act the same way in similar circumstances. The power of deontological thinking lies in its unwavering consistency and respect for human dignity. It treats people as ends in themselves, never merely as means to achieve other goals. This principle explains why deontologists condemn lying even to save lives, torture even to prevent greater suffering, or breaking promises even when doing so might produce better outcomes. The moral law, like gravity, operates regardless of our desires or the consequences that might follow. Consider the classic trolley problem through deontological eyes. A runaway trolley heads toward 5 people, but you can pull a lever to divert it onto a side track where it will kill 1 person instead. The consequentialist sees this as simple mathematics: 5 lives outweigh 1. But the deontologist faces a more complex calculation. Are you using the 1 person as a mere means to save the 5? Are you actively causing harm rather than merely allowing it to occur? Kant would likely argue that you cannot make yourself the author of the 1 person's death, even to prevent 5 deaths you didn't cause. This rigidity becomes both deontology's greatest strength and its most criticized weakness. Supporters praise its clarity, consistency, and protection of individual rights. Critics argue it can lead to moral absurdities, like refusing to lie to Nazi soldiers asking about hidden Jewish families, because lying is categorically wrong regardless of consequences. Consequentialism, particularly in its utilitarian form, approaches morality from an entirely different angle. This framework, championed by philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, judges actions solely by their outcomes. The rightness or wrongness of an action depends entirely on whether it produces better or worse consequences than available alternatives. The most famous consequentialist principle, the greatest good for the greatest number, transforms moral decision-making into a cost-benefit analysis of human welfare. Consequentialism's appeal lies in its intuitive focus on results. When facing moral dilemmas, most people naturally consider outcomes. We want our actions to make the world better, not worse. This framework provides tools for complex moral calculations, weighing different types of benefits and harms across various stakeholders. Modern consequentialists have developed sophisticated methods for considering not just immediate effects, but long-term consequences, probability distributions of outcomes, and even the welfare of future generations. In the trolley problem, consequentialism offers a clear answer: pull the lever. 5 lives matter more than 1 life, assuming all else is equal. This clarity extends to more complex scenarios. Should we torture one terrorist to prevent a nuclear attack? Consequentialism says yes if the calculation genuinely favors this outcome. Should we break a promise to attend a friend's birthday party if we could instead volunteer at a homeless shelter? Again, the math determines the answer. Yet consequentialism faces its own profound challenges. The utility monster thought experiment reveals how this framework might justify extreme inequality or oppression if the overall consequences are sufficiently positive. Critics argue that consequentialism fails to capture important moral intuitions about fairness, rights, and human dignity. It can demand enormous personal sacrifices. Why buy coffee when that money could save lives in developing countries? It also creates practical problems. How can we possibly calculate all consequences of our actions, especially long-term ones? The consequentialist response involves embracing these implications while refining the framework. Rule consequentialists argue for following rules that generally produce good outcomes, even when specific violations might seem beneficial. Preference utilitarians focus on satisfying people's actual preferences rather than imposing external judgments about their welfare. Negative consequentialists prioritize reducing suffering over increasing happiness. Virtue ethics, the oldest of these 3 approaches, sidesteps the action-focused orientation of both deontology and consequentialism. Tracing back to Aristotle, virtue ethics asks not "what should I do?" but "what kind of person should I be?" This framework focuses on moral character, the dispositions, habits, and excellences that constitute a flourishing human life. Aristotelian virtue ethics identifies specific virtues like courage, temperance, justice, and honesty as excellences of character that enable human flourishing. These virtues typically represent the golden mean between extremes of excess and deficiency. Courage, for instance, lies between cowardice, deficiency of courage, and recklessness, excess of courage. The virtuous person develops these excellences through practice and habituation, much like learning to play a musical instrument or mastering a sport. Rather than providing specific rules or calculating consequences, virtue ethics asks what a virtuous person would do in particular circumstances. This approach recognizes that moral life is too complex and contextual for simple universal principles or mechanical calculations. The virtuous person exercises practical wisdom, phronesis, to navigate particular situations, drawing on developed character traits and accumulated wisdom. In our trolley scenario, virtue ethics might ask, what would a just, compassionate, and wise person do? The answer might depend on additional contextual factors that rule-based or calculation-based approaches ignore. Is this situation one where active intervention aligns with virtuous character, or does it require the restraint and humility to avoid playing God with others' lives? Virtue ethics appeals to many because it aligns with how we actually think about moral role models. We admire people not just for following rules or producing good outcomes, but for being genuinely good people. We recognize that someone might follow all moral rules or optimize all consequences while still being fundamentally flawed in character. Conversely, we're drawn to people who embody virtues even when they sometimes make mistakes in judgment. Critics argue that virtue ethics provides insufficient guidance for specific moral decisions. What exactly would the virtuous person do when virtues conflict? How do we determine which character traits count as virtues across different cultures and historical periods? Modern virtue ethicists respond by developing more precise accounts of individual virtues and their applications to contemporary moral problems. These 3 frameworks often reach different conclusions about identical moral dilemmas, yet each captures important aspects of moral experience. Deontology honors our sense that some actions are intrinsically right or wrong regardless of consequences. Consequentialism respects our desire to make the world better through our choices. Virtue ethics acknowledges that moral life is ultimately about becoming the kind of people we ought to be. Perhaps most intriguingly, many philosophers now argue for moral pluralism, the view that each framework captures partial moral truths that must be integrated rather than choosing one approach exclusively. Real moral decisions might require considering our duties, calculating consequences, and reflecting on character simultaneously. As you contemplate these competing visions of morality, consider which resonates most deeply with your own moral intuitions. When you face difficult decisions, do you first think about universal principles, likely outcomes, or the kind of person you want to become? The answer might reveal something profound about your own moral psychology and the foundations of your ethical commitments. The Experience Machine, Ethics of Simulated Pleasure. Scientists approach you with an extraordinary offer. They've perfected a machine that can plug directly into your brain and provide you with any experiences you desire. Inside this machine, you could live the most fulfilling life imaginable, becoming a world-renowned artist, experiencing perfect love, achieving every dream you've ever harbored. The catch: once you enter, you'll never know it's not real. Every joy, every triumph, every moment of happiness will feel completely authentic, but it will all be artificially generated. You'll spend your actual life floating in a tank sustained by tubes, while your brain experiences a carefully crafted paradise. Would you plug in? This is the experience machine, a thought experiment introduced by philosopher Robert Nozick in 1974 that strikes at the heart of one of humanity's oldest questions. What makes life worth living? Is happiness the ultimate goal of human existence, or do we value something more than just feeling good? The machine presents what seems like an obvious choice for anyone who believes that pleasure and happiness are the highest goods. If life's purpose is to maximize positive experiences and minimize suffering, then the experience machine offers perfection. Inside, you could experience the satisfaction of curing cancer, the joy of winning Olympic gold, the bliss of perfect relationships, and the fulfillment of artistic creation, all without the risk, effort, or potential failure that accompanies real pursuits. Yet when Nozick first proposed this scenario, he discovered something remarkable. Most people recoil from the idea. Despite being offered guaranteed happiness and the elimination of all suffering, the vast majority say they would refuse to plug in. This visceral rejection reveals something profound about human values that pure hedonistic theories of well-being struggle to explain. The experience machine thought experiment was specifically designed to challenge hedonistic utilitarianism, the view that pleasure and the absence of pain are the only things that matter morally. If this theory were correct, we should eagerly embrace the machine. The fact that we don't suggest that we value things beyond mere subjective experiences of pleasure, no matter how intense or satisfying those experiences might be. Consider what we lose by entering the machine. We give up genuine achievement, the actual accomplishment of difficult goals through our own effort and skill. The machine might make you feel like you've written the great American novel, but you haven't actually created anything that exists in the world beyond your own experience. There's something we value about real achievement that simulated achievement, no matter how convincing, cannot provide. We also sacrifice authentic relationships. The machine could simulate perfect friendships, passionate romances, and loving family bonds, but these relationships would exist only in your mind. The other people you'd think you were connecting with would be mere figments of the machine's programming. Many philosophers argue that genuine relationships require reciprocity, the ability to actually affect and be affected by real other people with their own independent experiences and agency. The machine strips away moral agency as well. Inside the experience machine, you might feel like you're making difficult ethical choices and living a morally praiseworthy life, but your actions would have no real consequences. You couldn't actually help anyone, prevent any suffering, or contribute to making the world better. If moral agency is intrinsically valuable, if being able to make genuine moral choices matters independently of how those choices feel, then the machine represents a profound loss. Truth and reality themselves become casualties of the machine. Even if the experiences feel perfectly real, they aren't. Some philosophers argue that we have a fundamental preference for truth over pleasant illusion, that knowing and interacting with reality has value that transcends how good or bad that reality makes us feel. The machine offers the ultimate false consciousness, a comprehensive delusion that, while pleasant, disconnects us entirely from what's actually happening in the world. Personal growth and self-development also disappear in the machine. Real growth requires confronting challenges, overcoming obstacles, and learning from failures. The machine could simulate the feeling of growth, but without genuine difficulties to overcome, this development would be illusory. If becoming the best version of ourselves requires authentic struggle and learning, the machine's guarantee of unending pleasure actually prevents the very processes that make us fully human. Critics of Nozick's argument raise several objections. Some argue that our intuitive rejection of the machine stems from irrational biases rather than deep wisdom about human values. We might fear the unknown, feel attached to our current identity, or suffer from status quo bias that makes any dramatic change seem threatening. Perhaps if we really understood how much better life could be in the machine, we'd overcome these psychological obstacles. Others suggest that our rejection reflects cultural conditioning rather than universal human values. In a society that prizes achievement, independence, and authentic experience, we've been taught to value these things over happiness. But perhaps these preferences are arbitrary cultural constructs rather than deep truths about human flourishing. The problem of other people presents another challenge to anti-machine intuitions. If the machine could somehow include other real people, if we could all plug in together and share an enhanced virtual reality, would this address concerns about authentic relationships? Or if the machine were temporary, allowing us to dip in and out of enhanced experiences while maintaining connections to reality, would this preserve the values we think we're protecting? Modern technology has made the experience machine thought experiment increasingly relevant. Virtual and augmented reality systems are becoming more sophisticated. Social media platforms are designed to maximize engagement through carefully crafted psychological rewards, and various substances and technologies promise to enhance mood and experience. In some ways, many people are already choosing smaller versions of the experience machine when they lose themselves in video games, social media, or other forms of artificial stimulation. The rise of artificial intelligence adds new dimensions to the thought experiment. If AI systems become sophisticated enough to have their own experiences, should we create AI beings whose sole purpose is to experience maximum pleasure? Would such beings be living good lives, or would they be missing something essential that requires engagement with reality beyond their own subjective states? Some philosophers have tried to rescue hedonistic theories by arguing that our anti-machine intuitions reflect deeper insights about what kinds of pleasures are most valuable. Perhaps we reject the machine not because we don't value pleasure, but because we recognize that the best pleasures come from genuine achievement, real relationships, and authentic engagement with the world. The machine's pleasures, while intense, might be qualitatively inferior to the pleasures available through real living. Others propose that the machine fails to provide certain types of pleasure altogether. The satisfaction of genuine accomplishment, the joy of truly helping others, the pleasure of discovering real truths about the world, these might be categorically different from simulated versions, even if the simulated versions feel identical from the inside. The experience machine also connects to debates about mental health and psychiatric treatment. If someone is severely depressed and could be given medication that makes them feel constantly happy but removes their capacity for deep thought or authentic emotion, should they take it? How do we balance the value of subjective well-being against other goods like authenticity, rational reflection, and genuine human connection? Contemporary discussions about social media and technology often echo themes from the experience machine. When we curate perfect online personas, seek validation through likes and shares, or lose ourselves in carefully designed digital experiences, are we choosing pleasant illusions over authentic engagement with reality? The thought experiment suggests that even if these technologies make us feel better, they might be impoverishing us in ways we don't fully recognize. The machine ultimately forces us to examine what we think makes life meaningful. Is it enough to feel fulfilled, or must we actually be fulfilled in some objective sense? Do we need to accomplish real things, form genuine relationships, and engage with truth? Or are these needs just psychological quirks that we could happily abandon if we could directly stimulate the feelings they produce? As you consider whether you'd plug into the experience machine, you're really asking yourself what you ultimately value about being human. The answer reveals whether you see yourself primarily as a pleasure-seeking organism that wants to feel good, or as something more complex. A being that needs genuine achievement, authentic relationships, moral agency, and connection to reality to live a truly meaningful life, even if that life includes struggle, disappointment, and pain. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider what makes your own life worth living. Is it the experiences themselves, or something deeper about the reality behind those experiences? The problem of evil, suffering, and benevolence. A child dies of cancer after months of excruciating pain. An earthquake kills thousands of innocent people in minutes. A psychopath tortures victims for pleasure while living a comfortable life free from consequences. Meanwhile, millions pray to an allegedly all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God who seems to watch in silence. This stark reality presents philosophy's most emotionally wrenching puzzle. If God exists and possesses infinite power, knowledge, and goodness, why does evil exist at all? The problem of evil has tormented theologians, philosophers, and believers for millennia, striking at the foundations of religious faith and challenging our deepest assumptions about the nature of reality, justice, and divine purpose. It's not merely an abstract intellectual exercise, it's the question that keeps people awake at night when tragedy strikes, the doubt that emerges in hospital rooms and funeral parlors, the philosophical crisis that can shatter entire worldviews. The logical structure of this problem appears devastatingly simple. Traditional monotheistic religions claim God possesses three key attributes: omnipotence, unlimited power; omniscience, unlimited knowledge; and omnibenevolence, perfect goodness. Yet our world contains obvious instances of suffering and evil. If God has unlimited power, God could prevent evil. If God has unlimited knowledge, God knows about all existing evil. If God is perfectly good, God would want to prevent evil. The simultaneous existence of God and evil seems logically impossible. Philosophers distinguish between different types of evil that compound this puzzle. Natural evils include earthquakes, diseases, floods, and other sources of suffering that arise from natural processes rather than human choices. These seem particularly challenging to explain, since they can't be attributed to human free will or moral failure. Why would an all-good God create a universe where children are born with devastating genetic diseases or where natural disasters destroy innocent lives? Moral evils, by contrast, result from human choices: murder, torture, cruelty, oppression. While these might be explained by appealing to free will, they raise their own troubling questions. Why doesn't God intervene to prevent the worst atrocities? Why do evil people sometimes prosper while good people suffer? If God occasionally performs miracles, why not miracle away the Holocaust, genocide, or systematic torture? The evidential problem of evil presents a more subtle challenge than the logical version. Even if the existence of some evil is compatible with God's existence, the sheer quantity and intensity of suffering in our world seems to provide strong evidence against a perfectly good, all-powerful deity. Consider the scale: millions dying in famines, countless animals torn apart by predators, entire species going extinct, innocent people suffering from debilitating mental illnesses that destroy their capacity for happiness or meaningful relationships. This isn't merely about individual tragedies, but about the apparent systematic nature of suffering built into the very fabric of existence. Evolution requires death, competition, and suffering. Sentient beings must eat other beings to survive. Consciousness itself seems designed to experience pain as intensely as pleasure. Why would a perfectly good God choose this arrangement over alternatives that involve less suffering? Theodicy, the attempt to justify God's goodness despite the existence of evil, has produced numerous philosophical responses. The free will defense argues that God permits evil because free will is so valuable that its preservation justifies allowing the suffering that results from its misuse. According to this view, a world with free beings who can choose between good and evil is better than a world of automatons who always do good but have no real choice in the matter. But critics note that this defense faces several problems. First, it doesn't address natural evils that don't result from human choices. Second, it assumes that free will requires the ability to do evil, which some philosophers dispute. Third, it raises questions about why God doesn't intervene to prevent the worst consequences of evil choices while still preserving the freedom to make those choices. The soul-making theodicy, developed by philosophers like John Hick, suggests that suffering serves a greater purpose in developing human character and spiritual growth. According to this view, challenges, hardships, and moral struggles are necessary for humans to develop virtues like courage, compassion, perseverance, and wisdom. A world without suffering would be a world without the opportunity for moral and spiritual development. This approach faces its own difficulties. Much suffering seems to destroy rather than build character. Consider how extreme trauma can break people psychologically, or how genetic disorders can prevent normal human development entirely. Moreover, the distribution of suffering appears random rather than pedagogical. Why do some people face overwhelming challenges while others live comfortable lives? Why do children suffer from diseases before they're old enough to learn and grow from the experience? The greater good defense proposes that evils are justified because they serve larger purposes we cannot understand. Perhaps every instance of suffering prevents even greater suffering, or perhaps the complex web of causation means that eliminating any evil would ultimately result in worse outcomes. From this perspective, our limited human perspective prevents us from seeing how apparent evils fit into God's perfect plan. Critics argue that this response essentially abandons rational discourse about the problem. If we can't evaluate whether evils are truly necessary for greater goods, then we can't meaningfully discuss God's goodness at all. Moreover, this defense seems to make moral reasoning impossible. If apparent evils might actually be good, how can we make any moral judgments about anything? Some philosophers take a more radical approach, questioning the assumptions underlying the problem of evil. process, theologians argue that God is not actually omnipotent in the traditional sense, that God influences but cannot completely control natural processes or human choices. This God experiences and suffers along with creation but cannot simply eliminate evil by divine fiat. Others question whether perfect goodness necessarily requires preventing all suffering. Perhaps some values, like justice, authenticity, or respect for natural processes, sometimes conflict with the prevention of suffering. A perfectly good God might balance multiple values rather than prioritizing the elimination of suffering above all else. The skeptical theist response argues that humans simply cannot know whether the evils we observe are gratuitous or serve purposes beyond our comprehension. Given the vast difference between human and divine knowledge, we should expect that God's reasons for permitting evil would often be inscrutable to us. From this perspective, our inability to see the justification for particular evils doesn't provide evidence against God's existence. But this response raises troubling implications for moral reasoning. If we can't distinguish between gratuitous and justified suffering, how can we make moral decisions about preventing harm? Should doctors stop treating diseases, since illness might serve divine purposes we don't understand? Should we stop opposing injustice, since apparent evils might actually be good? Contemporary philosophers continue developing new approaches to the problem of evil. Some argue that the very notion of God as maximally great being requires reconsidering what omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness actually mean. Others explore whether certain goods might be incompatible with the prevention of evil. Whether, for instance, the good of creatures having genuine causal powers necessarily involves the possibility of causing harm. The problem extends beyond traditional theistic religions. Buddhism must explain why existence involves suffering if reality is ultimately characterized by compassion. Secular worldviews must grapple with whether moral evil has any objective significance if humans are merely evolved animals following biological programming. The emotional dimension of the problem of evil cannot be separated from its intellectual aspects. This isn't merely about logical consistency, but about finding meaning in the face of tragedy, maintaining hope despite injustice, and preserving faith when experience seems to contradict our deepest beliefs about goodness and purpose. For believers, the problem of evil often represents a crisis that must be lived through rather than simply solved intellectually. The Book of Job illustrates this experiential dimension. Job's friends offer various theodicies, but Job finds these explanations inadequate in the face of his actual suffering. The resolution comes not through logical argument but through encounter with the divine mystery itself. For non-believers, the problem of evil raises equally challenging questions. If there is no God, why does the existence of suffering bother us so much? Why do we have such strong intuitions about injustice and moral wrongness? Does evil have any real significance in a universe that arose through purely natural processes without moral purpose? The problem also connects to questions about the meaning of life and the foundation of ethics. If God doesn't exist to guarantee ultimate justice, does morality matter? If God does exist but permits terrible suffering, can we trust that moral effort is worthwhile? Either way, the problem of evil forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of reality and our place within it. As you contemplate these ancient questions tonight, consider not just the logical puzzles they present, but the lived reality they address. Whether you believe in God or not, the existence of suffering and evil demands a response: intellectual, emotional, and practical. How do we maintain compassion in the face of cruelty? How do we find meaning despite tragedy? How do we balance acknowledgement of evil with hope for goodness? The problem of evil ultimately asks us to examine what we believe about the deepest structure of reality and how those beliefs shape our response to both suffering and joy. The problem of evil, suffering, and benevolence. A child dies of cancer after months of excruciating pain. An earthquake kills thousands of innocent people in minutes. A psychopath tortures victims for pleasure while living a comfortable life free from consequences. Meanwhile, millions pray to an allegedly all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God who seems to watch in silence. This stark reality presents philosophy's most emotionally wrenching puzzle. If God exists and possesses infinite power, knowledge, and goodness, why does evil exist at all? The problem of evil has tormented theologians, philosophers, and believers for millennia, striking at the foundations of religious faith and challenging our deepest assumptions about the nature of reality, justice, and divine purpose. It's not merely an abstract intellectual exercise, it's the question that keeps people awake at night when tragedy strikes, the doubt that emerges in hospital rooms and funeral parlors, the philosophical crisis that can shatter entire worldviews. The logical structure of this problem appears devastatingly simple. Traditional monotheistic religions claim God possesses three key attributes: omnipotence, unlimited power; omniscience, unlimited knowledge; and omnibenevolence, perfect goodness. Yet our world contains obvious instances of suffering and evil. If God has unlimited power, God could prevent evil. If God has unlimited knowledge, God knows about all existing evil. If God is perfectly good, God would want to prevent evil. The simultaneous existence of God and evil seems logically impossible. Philosophers distinguish between different types of evil that compound this puzzle. Natural evils include earthquakes, diseases, floods, and other sources of suffering that arise from natural processes rather than human choices. These seem particularly challenging to explain, since they can't be attributed to human free will or moral failure. Why would an all-good God create a universe where children are born with devastating genetic diseases or where natural disasters destroy innocent lives? Moral evils, by contrast, result from human choices: murder, torture, cruelty, oppression. While these might be explained by appealing to free will, they raise their own troubling questions. Why doesn't God intervene to prevent the worst atrocities? Why do evil people sometimes prosper while good people suffer? If God occasionally performs miracles, why not miracle away the Holocaust, genocide, or systematic torture? The evidential problem of evil presents a more subtle challenge than the logical version. Even if the existence of some evil is compatible with God's existence, the sheer quantity and intensity of suffering in our world seems to provide strong evidence against a perfectly good, all-powerful deity. Consider the scale: millions dying in famines, countless animals torn apart by predators, entire species going extinct, innocent people suffering from debilitating mental illnesses that destroy their capacity for happiness or meaningful relationships. This isn't merely about individual tragedies, but about the apparent systematic nature of suffering built into the very fabric of existence. Evolution requires death, competition, and suffering. Sentient beings must eat other beings to survive. Consciousness itself seems designed to experience pain as intensely as pleasure. Why would a perfectly good God choose this arrangement over alternatives that involve less suffering? Theodicy, the attempt to justify God's goodness despite the existence of evil, has produced numerous philosophical responses. The free will defense argues that God permits evil because free will is so valuable that its preservation justifies allowing the suffering that results from its misuse. According to this view, a world with free beings who can choose between good and evil is better than a world of automatons who always do good but have no real choice in the matter. But critics note that this defense faces several problems. First, it doesn't address natural evils that don't result from human choices. Second, it assumes that free will requires the ability to do evil, which some philosophers dispute. Third, it raises questions about why God doesn't intervene to prevent the worst consequences of evil choices while still preserving the freedom to make those choices. The soul-making theodicy, developed by philosophers like John Hick, suggests that suffering serves a greater purpose in developing human character and spiritual growth. According to this view, challenges, hardships, and moral struggles are necessary for humans to develop virtues like courage, compassion, perseverance, and wisdom. A world without suffering would be a world without the opportunity for moral and spiritual development. This approach faces its own difficulties. Much suffering seems to destroy rather than build character. Consider how extreme trauma can break people psychologically, or how genetic disorders can prevent normal human development entirely. Moreover, the distribution of suffering appears random rather than pedagogical. Why do some people face overwhelming challenges while others live comfortable lives? Why do children suffer from diseases before they're old enough to learn and grow from the experience? The greater good defense proposes that evils are justified because they serve larger purposes we cannot understand. Perhaps every instance of suffering prevents even greater suffering, or perhaps the complex web of causation means that eliminating any evil would ultimately result in worse outcomes. From this perspective, our limited human perspective prevents us from seeing how apparent evils fit into God's perfect plan. Critics argue that this response essentially abandons rational discourse about the problem. If we can't evaluate whether evils are truly necessary for greater goods, then we can't meaningfully discuss God's goodness at all. Moreover, this defense seems to make moral reasoning impossible. If apparent evils might actually be good, how can we make any moral judgments about anything? Some philosophers take a more radical approach, questioning the assumptions underlying the problem of evil. Process theologians argue that God is not actually omnipotent in the traditional sense, that God influences but cannot completely control natural processes or human choices. This God experiences and suffers along with creation but cannot simply eliminate evil by divine fiat. Others question whether perfect goodness necessarily requires preventing all suffering. Perhaps some values, like justice, authenticity, or respect for natural processes, sometimes conflict with the prevention of suffering. A perfectly good God might balance multiple values rather than prioritizing the elimination of suffering above all else. The skeptical theist response argues that humans simply cannot know whether the evils we observe are gratuitous or serve purposes beyond our comprehension. Given the vast difference between human and divine knowledge, we should expect that God's reasons for permitting evil would often be inscrutable to us. From this perspective, our inability to see the justification for particular evils doesn't provide evidence against God's existence. But this response raises troubling implications for moral reasoning. If we can't distinguish between gratuitous and justified suffering, how can we make moral decisions about preventing harm? Should doctors stop treating diseases, since illness might serve divine purposes we don't understand? Should we stop opposing injustice, since apparent evils might actually be good? Contemporary philosophers continue developing new approaches to the problem of evil. Some argue that the very notion of God as maximally great being requires reconsidering what omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness actually mean. Others explore whether certain goods might be incompatible with the prevention of evil. Whether, for instance, the good of creatures having genuine causal powers necessarily involves the possibility of causing harm. The problem extends beyond traditional theistic religions. Buddhism must explain why existence involves suffering if reality is ultimately characterized by compassion. Secular worldviews must grapple with whether moral evil has any objective significance if humans are merely evolved animals following biological programming. The emotional dimension of the problem of evil cannot be separated from its intellectual aspects. This isn't merely about logical consistency, but about finding meaning in the face of tragedy, maintaining hope despite injustice, and preserving faith when experience seems to contradict our deepest beliefs about goodness and purpose. For believers, the problem of evil often represents a crisis that must be lived through rather than simply solved intellectually. The Book of Job illustrates this experiential dimension. Job's friends offer various theodicies, but Job finds these explanations inadequate in the face of his actual suffering. The resolution comes not through logical argument but through encounter with the divine mystery itself. For non-believers, the problem of evil raises equally challenging questions. If there is no God, why does the existence of suffering bother us so much? Why do we have such strong intuitions about injustice and moral wrongness? Does evil have any real significance in a universe that arose through purely natural processes without moral purpose? The problem also connects to questions about the meaning of life and the foundation of ethics. If God doesn't exist to guarantee ultimate justice, does morality matter? If God does exist but permits terrible suffering, can we trust that moral effort is worthwhile? Either way, the problem of evil forces us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of reality and our place within it. As you contemplate these ancient questions tonight, consider not just the logical puzzles they present, but the lived reality they address. Whether you believe in God or not, the existence of suffering and evil demands a response: intellectual, emotional, and practical. How do we maintain compassion in the face of cruelty? How do we find meaning despite tragedy? How do we balance acknowledgement of evil with hope for goodness? The problem of evil ultimately asks us to examine what we believe about the deepest structure of reality and how those beliefs shape our response to both suffering and joy. Animal rights and moral status. A chimpanzee sits in a research laboratory, its eyes reflecting what appears to be fear and confusion as scientists prepare another invasive procedure. Meanwhile, billions of pigs, animals more intelligent than dogs, spend their lives in cramped factory farm conditions before slaughter. In the wild, an octopus demonstrates problem-solving abilities that rival those of young children, yet it receives no legal protection from being boiled alive. These scenarios force us to confront one of ethics' most challenging questions. What gives a being moral status, and where do we draw the line between entities that deserve moral consideration and those that don't? For most of human history, this question seemed to have an obvious answer. Humans possessed souls, rationality, language, and divine blessing that separated us categorically from all other animals. This view, deeply embedded in religious traditions and philosophical systems, justified treating animals as mere resources for human use. Animals existed to serve human purposes, as food, clothing, labor, entertainment, and experimental subjects, with no independent moral claims on our consideration. But this comfortable certainty has crumbled under scientific discoveries about animal cognition, emotion, and consciousness. We now know that many animals experience pain, fear, joy, and complex social relationships in ways that closely parallel human experiences. Elephants mourn their dead, dolphins recognize themselves in mirrors, crows use tools and teach their offspring, and pigs demonstrate cognitive abilities that surpass those of 3-year-old children. These revelations force us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about what characteristics grant moral status and whom we include in our moral community. The philosophical tradition offers several competing criteria for moral consideration. The capacity for suffering, first prominently advocated by utilitarian philosopher Jeremy Bentham, suggests that the ability to experience pain and pleasure is the relevant characteristic for moral status. As Bentham famously wrote, the question is not, can they reason? Nor can they talk? But can they suffer? This criterion would extend moral consideration to most vertebrates and potentially some invertebrates, since suffering appears to serve an important evolutionary function across many species. Rationality represents another traditional criterion, championed by philosophers like Immanuel Kant. According to this view, rational beings capable of moral reasoning deserve respect as ends in themselves, while non-rational beings can be treated as means to rational beings' ends. This perspective maintains clear boundaries between humans and other animals, but it raises uncomfortable questions about humans with severe cognitive disabilities, young children, and individuals with dementia. If rationality determines moral status, do these humans have lesser moral claims than typical adults? Consciousness offers a broader criterion that might include many animals while maintaining some distinction from plants and simpler organisms. But consciousness itself proves notoriously difficult to define and detect. We cannot directly access other beings' subjective experiences, whether human or animal. Scientists have developed behavioral and neurological indicators of consciousness, but debates continue about which animals possess genuine subjective experience versus merely responding to stimuli in complex but unconscious ways. The capacity for relationships and social bonds presents another possible criterion. Many animals form deep attachments to others of their species and sometimes to humans. Elephants maintain lifelong family relationships, wolves operate in complex social hierarchies, and many species demonstrate empathy and altruistic behavior. If the ability to form meaningful relationships contributes to moral status, then highly social animals might deserve greater consideration than solitary species. Peter Singer, perhaps the most influential contemporary philosopher advocating for animal rights, argues that the capacity for suffering is the only relevant criterion for moral consideration. Singer's utilitarian approach suggests we should weigh animal suffering equally with comparable human suffering in our moral calculations. This principle has radical implications for practices like factory farming, medical experimentation, and entertainment that causes animal suffering for human benefit. Singer's position faces the challenge of explaining why capacity for suffering, rather than other characteristics, should determine moral status. Critics argue that while suffering matters morally, other factors like rationality, autonomy, and moral agency create additional layers of moral significance. A being capable of making moral choices and taking responsibility for actions might deserve different consideration than one that suffers but cannot engage in moral reasoning. Tom Regan offers an alternative rights-based approach to animal ethics. Rather than focusing solely on utilitarian calculations about suffering, Regan argues that many animals are subjects of a life. Beings with beliefs, desires, memory, and a sense of their own future. These animals have inherent value that generates rights not to be harmed, regardless of consequences for overall welfare. This approach provides stronger protections for individual animals but struggles to define precisely which animals qualify as subjects of a life. The moral status of different species varies dramatically based on which criteria we emphasize. Great apes, with their sophisticated cognitive abilities and complex social structures, present perhaps the strongest case for extensive moral consideration. Several countries have granted legal rights to great apes, prohibiting invasive research and recognizing their psychological complexity. But what about dolphins, elephants, and other highly intelligent species that might deserve similar consideration? The question becomes more complex as we move beyond mammals to birds, reptiles, fish, and invertebrates. Birds demonstrate remarkable cognitive abilities, ravens can plan for future events, and some parrots can engage in rudimentary mathematical reasoning. Fish show evidence of pain responses and learning abilities that suggest conscious experience. Even octopuses, with their decentralized nervous systems, display problem-solving skills and apparent playfulness that might indicate consciousness. Insects present a particularly challenging case. Their sheer numbers mean that if insects deserve moral consideration, the implications would be staggering. Every pesticide application, every step we take, every agricultural practice would involve massive moral harm. Yet some research suggests that even bees and ants might experience rudimentary forms of consciousness. How do we balance potential insect suffering against human needs and the practical impossibility of avoiding all harm to these tiny creatures? The practical implications of expanding moral consideration to animals are enormous. Factory farming, which causes suffering to billions of animals annually, becomes difficult to justify if animals have significant moral status. Medical research that uses animal subjects must weigh potential human benefits against certain animal harm. Zoos, circuses, and other forms of animal entertainment face ethical scrutiny when they prioritize human pleasure over animal welfare. Environmental considerations complicate these individual-focused approaches to animal ethics. Predator-prey relationships in nature involve constant suffering and death, yet most people don't think we should intervene to prevent lions from killing gazelles. Conservation efforts sometimes require culling certain animal populations to protect ecosystems or endangered species. How do we balance concern for individual animal welfare with broader environmental values? Cultural differences in attitudes toward animals reveal the contingent nature of our moral boundaries. Many Western societies treat dogs and cats as family members while consuming pigs and cows without moral concern, despite similar cognitive capacities across these species. Hindu traditions extend moral consideration to cows while accepting the use of other animals. These cultural variations suggest that our moral intuitions about animals may be shaped more by cultural conditioning than by objective characteristics of the animals themselves. Legal systems worldwide are beginning to grapple with questions of animal moral status. Some jurisdictions have banned certain forms of animal cruelty, restricted invasive research, or improved conditions in agricultural settings. A few countries have granted legal personhood to specific animals or species, recognizing them as beings with rights rather than mere property. But legal recognition remains inconsistent and often conflicts with economic interests that depend on animal use. The emergence of laboratory-grown meat and other technological alternatives to animal products may eventually render some of these debates moot. If we can produce animal products without animal suffering, the moral case for using animals diminishes significantly. But these technologies raise their own questions about naturalness, environmental impact, and economic disruption to communities dependent on animal agriculture. Future advances in our understanding of animal consciousness and cognition will likely continue expanding the circle of moral consideration. As we develop better methods for detecting consciousness and measuring subjective experience, we may discover that moral status extends to species we currently ignore. Conversely, we might find that consciousness is rarer than we assumed, providing comfort to those who resist expanding animal rights. The question of artificial consciousness adds another layer of complexity. If we create AI systems with apparent consciousness and capacity for suffering, would they deserve moral consideration? How would we compare the moral status of artificial minds with biological animals? These future scenarios highlight how our concepts of moral status must evolve with new scientific and technological developments. As you reflect on these questions tonight, consider your own relationships with animals and the moral boundaries you draw. Do you treat different animals differently based on their species, their cognitive abilities, or their relationship to humans? What justifies these distinctions? The answers reveal not just your beliefs about animals, but fundamental assumptions about the nature of moral consideration and the criteria that determine who counts in our moral calculations. The expansion of moral consideration to animals represents one of the great moral advances of our time, yet it also reveals how much our moral intuitions depend on scientific understanding, cultural conditioning, and practical constraints that continue to evolve. Environmental ethics, human versus nature value. An ancient redwood forest stands majestically, its trees having grown for over 1,000 years, creating a complex ecosystem that supports countless species and plays a vital role in global climate regulation. But beneath this forest lies a massive deposit of rare earth minerals essential for renewable energy technology that could help address climate change. Extracting these minerals would destroy the irreplaceable forest but might enable technologies that prevent greater environmental catastrophe. Should we preserve this unique ecosystem for its intrinsic value, or sacrifice it for humanity's long-term survival? This dilemma encapsulates one of philosophy's most urgent contemporary challenges: determining humanity's proper relationship with the natural world. Environmental ethics emerged as a distinct philosophical discipline only in the 1970s, sparked by growing awareness of humanity's capacity to fundamentally alter Earth's systems. For most of human history, nature seemed vast and inexhaustible compared to human impact. But the Industrial Revolution, population growth, and technological advancement have made humans a geological force capable of triggering mass extinctions, altering global climate and transforming landscapes on a planetary scale. This new reality demands ethical frameworks adequate to guide human behavior toward the natural world. Traditional Western ethics focused almost exclusively on relationships between humans, treating nature as merely a backdrop for human moral drama. Classical moral theories, whether utilitarian, deontological, or virtue-based, developed frameworks for human-to-human obligations but said little about duties toward non-human nature. The dominant worldview saw nature as a collection of resources created for human use, with no independent moral standing or intrinsic value beyond its utility to human purposes. This anthropocentric approach justified extensive modification and exploitation of natural systems. Forests became timber reserves, rivers became transportation and power sources, and wilderness became land awaiting development. Environmental problems were addressed only when they threatened human welfare. Pollution control emerged not from concern for nature itself, but from recognition that environmental degradation harmed human health and economic interests. But as scientific understanding of ecological systems deepened, philosophers began questioning whether this exclusively human-centered approach adequately captured our moral obligations. Ecology revealed the interconnectedness of natural systems, showing how human welfare depends on healthy ecosystems, biodiversity, and stable climate patterns. This recognition suggested that protecting nature serves human interests, but it also raised questions about whether nature might have moral value beyond its instrumental utility to humans. Biocentric ethics extends moral consideration beyond humans to include all living beings. Philosophers like Albert Schweitzer advocated reverence for life, arguing that life itself has inherent value regardless of its usefulness to humans. This perspective suggests that destroying living beings requires moral justification and that we should minimize harm to all life when possible. Under biocentric ethics, clear-cutting forests or destroying habitats becomes morally problematic not just because it affects humans, but because it eliminates countless individual living organisms with their own claims to existence. But biocentrism faces practical challenges in guiding specific decisions. If all life has equal value, how do we choose between competing life forms? Should we prevent antibiotic use because it kills bacteria? Should we stop gardening because it disrupts soil microorganisms? The theory struggles to provide practical guidance when different life forms conflict, and it seems to require moral consideration for entities, like bacteria or plants, that lack consciousness or the capacity for suffering. Ecocentric ethics takes an even broader approach, extending moral consideration to ecological wholes, ecosystems, species, and the biosphere itself. Aldo Leopold articulated this perspective in his influential Land Ethic, declaring that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. This approach values ecosystems as integrated wholes rather than merely collections of individual organisms. Ecocentrism can justify practices that biocentrism might condemn. Culling overpopulated species to protect ecosystem health, allowing natural wildfires to burn, or removing invasive species might harm individual organisms but benefit the broader ecological community. This perspective also provides strong arguments for preserving wilderness areas, protecting endangered species, and maintaining biodiversity even when doing so conflicts with immediate human interests. Critics argue that ecocentric ethics faces the problem of environmental fascism, potentially justifying harm to individuals for the supposed good of ecological wholes. If ecosystem health trumps individual welfare, might this approach support removing human populations from ecologically valuable areas? How do we balance the rights of individual organisms against the health of ecosystems? The theory struggles to explain why ecological wholes should have moral status if their component individuals don't. Deep ecology, developed by philosopher Arne Naess, offers a more radical challenge to anthropocentric thinking. This approach argues for the intrinsic value of all natural entities and processes, advocating for a fundamental shift in human consciousness from seeing ourselves as separate from and superior to nature toward recognizing our essential interconnectedness with the natural world. Deep ecology calls for reducing human population and economic activity to allow other species and natural systems to flourish. Deep ecology's emphasis on interconnectedness resonates with many environmental activists and offers a spiritual dimension often missing from purely rational ethical approaches. But critics question whether it provides sufficient guidance for specific environmental decisions and worry that its anti-humanistic tendencies might justify policies that harm human welfare for abstract environmental benefits. Ecofeminism connects environmental destruction with patriarchal domination, arguing that the same conceptual frameworks that justify the oppression of women also enable the exploitation of nature. This perspective sees both women and nature as devalued under patriarchal systems that privilege masculine traits like rationality, control, and domination over feminine traits like nurturing, cooperation, and interconnectedness. Ecofeminist analysis reveals how environmental problems often disproportionately affect women, particularly in developing countries where women bear primary responsibility for securing water, fuel, and food for their families. Climate change, deforestation, and pollution create additional burdens for women while men often control the resources and decisions that could address these problems. Social ecology, developed by Murray Bookchin, argues that environmental problems stem from social problems, particularly hierarchy, domination, and economic inequality. According to this view, we cannot solve environmental crises without addressing the social systems that generate them. Environmental destruction results from capitalist economic systems that prioritize short-term profit over long-term sustainability and political systems that concentrate power in ways that enable environmental exploitation. This approach suggests that environmental protection requires fundamental social transformation, democratizing decision-making, reducing economic inequality, and creating economic systems that prioritize ecological sustainability over unlimited growth. Social ecologists argue that environmental ethics must address questions of power, justice, and social organization rather than focusing solely on human relationships with nature. Environmental pragmatism offers a different approach, arguing that we should use whatever ethical frameworks prove most effective for addressing specific environmental problems rather than seeking one comprehensive environmental ethic. Pragmatists note that different environmental challenges might require different moral approaches. Anthropocentric arguments might work best for some audiences and issues, while ecocentric appeals might prove more effective in other contexts. This approach emphasizes building coalitions across different ethical perspectives and focusing on shared environmental goals despite disagreements about ultimate foundations. Environmental pragmatists prioritize practical effectiveness over theoretical consistency, arguing that environmental crises are too urgent to wait for philosophical consensus about nature's moral status. Climate change presents perhaps the greatest challenge for environmental ethics, involving unprecedented spatial and temporal scales of moral consideration. The greenhouse gases emitted today will affect global climate for centuries, harming people not yet born and living in distant locations. Traditional ethical frameworks struggle with these extended causal chains and multigenerational impacts. Climate ethics must address questions of distributive justice. How should the costs of addressing climate change be distributed between rich and poor countries, between current and future generations, between those who caused the problem and those who suffer its consequences? Should climate policy prioritize minimizing total harm, protecting the most vulnerable populations, or ensuring that costs are borne by those most responsible for the problem? Intergenerational justice becomes central to climate ethics. What do we owe to future generations who will inherit the consequences of our environmental choices? Some philosophers argue that future people have the same moral claims as present people, suggesting we should make significant sacrifices now to protect future welfare. Others question whether we can have obligations to people who don't yet exist and whose existence might depend on the very choices we're evaluating. The Anthropocene, the proposed geological epoch defined by human impact on Earth's systems, forces us to reconceptualize humanity's role in nature. Rather than seeing humans as separate from or opposed to nature, we must recognize that human activity now shapes virtually every natural system on Earth. This reality suggests that pristine wilderness preservation, while valuable, cannot be the sole focus of environmental ethics. Instead, we need frameworks for managing human-dominated landscapes, hybrid ecosystems that combine natural and artificial elements, and urban environments where most humans now live. Environmental ethics must address questions about genetic modification, geoengineering, species conservation in human-modified habitats, and the ethics of rewilding projects that attempt to restore ecosystems to previous states. Technology complicates traditional environmental ethics. Renewable energy reduces carbon emissions but requires mining that destroys habitats. Nuclear power offers clean energy but creates radioactive waste. Genetic modification might help crops adapt to climate change but raises concerns about naturalness and unintended consequences. Environmental ethics must evaluate these trade-offs while acknowledging uncertainty about long-term consequences. As you contemplate your own relationship with the natural world tonight, consider what moral obligations you think humans have toward non-human nature. Do you believe nature has value only insofar as it serves human purposes, or does it possess intrinsic worth that generates independent moral claims? How do you balance human needs against environmental protection? These questions reveal fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the natural world and our responsibilities toward the ecosystems that sustain all life on Earth. The answers we choose will determine whether future generations inherit a flourishing planet or a degraded environment that reflects our failure to develop adequate ethical frameworks for the Anthropocene era. Genetic engineering ethics, designer babies? A couple sits across from a genetic counselor, scrolling through what looks like a catalog of human traits. Enhanced intelligence? Reduced risk of heart disease? Immunity to certain cancers? Athletic ability? Eye color? Each modification comes with a price tag and a probability of success. Their future child's genetic makeup lies before them as a series of choices, each decision shaping not just their offspring's life, but potentially the future of human evolution itself. This scenario, once pure science fiction, edges closer to reality as gene editing technologies like CRISPR make precise genetic modifications increasingly feasible and affordable. Genetic engineering represents one of the most profound ethical frontiers humanity has ever faced, challenging fundamental assumptions about human nature, parental responsibility, social justice, and the limits of acceptable intervention in biological processes. Unlike previous medical technologies that treat diseases after they occur, genetic engineering offers the possibility of preventing conditions before birth, enhancing human capabilities beyond typical ranges, and potentially altering the human species permanently. The therapeutic applications of genetic engineering generate relatively little controversy. Few people object to correcting genetic defects that cause severe suffering. Eliminating genes that cause Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, or sickle cell anemia seems clearly beneficial. These interventions align with traditional medical goals of treating disease and reducing suffering. When genetic modifications clearly prevent serious medical conditions without significant risks or side effects, the ethical case appears straightforward. But the line between therapy and enhancement proves far more blurred than initial appearances suggest. Is correcting nearsightedness therapy or enhancement? What about preventing baldness, increasing height, or boosting immune function? These modifications improve human capabilities and quality of life, but they don't address conditions that most people would classify as diseases. As our understanding of genetics advances, we're discovering that many traits we consider normal variations, like intelligence, personality characteristics, or athletic ability, have genetic components that could theoretically be modified. Enhancement applications raise profound questions about human nature and the goals of human life. Should parents be allowed to genetically modify their children to be more intelligent, more attractive, or more physically capable? If such modifications become available, do parents have an obligation to provide them for their children's benefit? Or do we have duties to preserve something essential about unmodified human nature? The concept of human dignity features prominently in debates about genetic enhancement. Some philosophers argue that human dignity requires accepting people as they are, without attempting to engineer improvements according to particular standards or preferences. This perspective suggests that genetic enhancement treats children as products to be designed rather than persons to be welcomed, reducing human reproduction to a form of manufacturing. Critics of the dignity-based argument respond that we already intervene extensively in human development through education, nutrition, medical care, and environmental modifications. If we can enhance children's capabilities through these means, why should genetic interventions be categorically different? They argue that genetic modifications might be more effective and less invasive than alternative methods of achieving similar improvements. The question of consent presents another ethical challenge unique to genetic engineering. Unlike other medical interventions, genetic modifications affect people who cannot consent to the procedures, future children who don't yet exist. Parents routinely make decisions that profoundly shape their children's lives, from choosing schools to determining religious upbringing. But genetic modifications are permanent and affect the most fundamental aspects of a person's biology and capabilities. Some argue that parents have not just the right but the obligation to provide their children with the best possible genetic endowments. If genetic modifications can prevent diseases, increase intelligence, or improve quality of life, then failing to provide these benefits might constitute a form of neglect. From this perspective, genetic enhancement represents an extension of parental responsibility rather than an inappropriate intervention. Others contend that genetic modifications violate children's right to an open future by foreclosing possibilities and imposing parental values on fundamental aspects of their identity. A child genetically modified for exceptional athletic ability might be pressured toward sports careers that don't align with their actual interests. Genetic modifications might also create expectations and pressures that burden children with living up to their enhanced capabilities. Social justice concerns add another layer of complexity to genetic engineering ethics. If genetic enhancements become available but remain expensive, they could exacerbate existing inequalities by creating biological advantages for wealthy families. Children from affluent backgrounds might receive genetic modifications that improve their intelligence, health, and appearance, while children from poor families must rely on their natural genetic endowments. This scenario could create a genetically stratified society where class differences become literally encoded in biology. Over time, genetic advantages might compound across generations, creating permanent biological castes that make current social inequalities seem minor by comparison. The enhanced and unenhanced might eventually diverge into effectively different species, with the enhanced possessing capabilities that the unenhanced could never achieve through effort alone. Defenders of genetic enhancement argue that many beneficial technologies initially remain expensive before becoming widely accessible. Cars, computers, and medical treatments often begin as luxury items before mass production and technological advancement make them affordable for broader populations. They suggest that genetic enhancements might follow similar patterns, eventually becoming available to all rather than creating permanent genetic inequality. But critics note that genetic modifications differ from other technologies in their permanence and heritability. A child who doesn't receive genetic enhancements might be permanently disadvantaged in ways that can't be remedied later in life. Unlike material inequalities that can potentially be addressed through redistribution or social programs, genetic inequalities might prove irreversible. The possibility of unintended consequences raises additional ethical concerns about genetic engineering. Our understanding of genetics remains incomplete, and complex interactions between genes, environment, and development mean that genetic modifications might have unforeseen effects. A modification intended to increase intelligence might also increase susceptibility to mental illness. An enhancement designed to improve physical strength might create psychological side effects or health problems that emerge only later in life. These risks are particularly concerning because genetic modifications affect not just the individuals who receive them, but potentially their descendants. Germline modifications, changes to reproductive cells that can be passed to future generations, might create problems that persist for multiple generations before being detected. The precautionary principle suggests we should proceed cautiously with genetic modifications, especially those with irreversible effects. Cultural and religious perspectives on genetic engineering vary dramatically. Some religious traditions view genetic modifications as inappropriate interference with divine creation, arguing that humans should accept their genetic endowments as gifts from God rather than attempting to improve upon divine design. Others see genetic engineering as an extension of human stewardship responsibilities, arguing that we have obligations to use our capabilities to reduce suffering and improve human welfare. Different cultures also vary in their attitudes toward enhancement, individual autonomy, and social responsibility. Collectivist societies might be more accepting of genetic modifications that benefit society as a whole, even if they constrain individual choice. Individualist cultures might emphasize parental freedom to make genetic choices for their children, while other societies might prefer collective decision-making about acceptable genetic modifications. The regulation of genetic engineering presents practical challenges that reflect these underlying ethical disagreements. Some countries have banned or strictly regulated genetic modifications to human embryos, while others have permitted research and clinical applications under certain conditions. These regulatory differences could create genetic tourism, where people travel to countries with more permissive policies to access genetic modifications unavailable in their home countries. International coordination becomes crucial as genetic engineering technologies advance. Without global cooperation, regulatory restrictions in some countries might be undermined by more permissive policies elsewhere. The competitive pressures of genetic enhancement could create races to the bottom, where countries feel compelled to allow genetic modifications to prevent their populations from falling behind genetically enhanced populations in other nations. The long-term implications of genetic engineering for human evolution raise philosophical questions about the future of our species. If genetic modifications become widespread, they could accelerate and direct human evolution in unprecedented ways. Rather than relying on natural selection operating over thousands of years, we might consciously guide human development according to our current understanding of desirable traits. This prospect both excites and terrifies different observers. Proponents envision eliminating genetic diseases, enhancing human capabilities, and adapting our species to future challenges like climate change or space exploration. Critics worry about losing essential aspects of human nature, creating irreversible changes based on flawed understanding, or concentrating evolutionary power in the hands of those wealthy or powerful enough to access genetic technologies. The ethics of genetic engineering ultimately forces us to confront fundamental questions about human nature, social justice, and our responsibilities to future generations. Do we have obligations to preserve human nature as we found it, or should we actively work to improve the human condition through genetic modifications? How do we balance individual freedom with collective welfare when genetic choices affect not just individuals but entire societies? What do we owe to future generations who will inherit the consequences of our genetic choices? As you reflect on these questions tonight, consider what genetic modifications, if any, you would want for your own children. What traits do you consider essential to preserve, and what aspects of human nature might be appropriate to enhance? Your answers reveal deep assumptions about human flourishing, parental responsibility, and the proper scope of human control over biological processes. The choices we make about genetic engineering will literally shape the future of human evolution and determine what kind of species we become. The ethics of truth-telling versus lying, Kant versus utilitarianism. Nazi soldiers pound on your door, demanding to know if you're hiding Jewish refugees. In your basement, 3 families huddle in terror, their lives hanging on your next words. Do you tell the truth and condemn innocent people to death, or do you lie to save their lives? This stark scenario, often discussed in ethics classes, illuminates one of philosophy's most fundamental tensions: the conflict between absolute moral duties and consequentialist reasoning about outcomes. Your answer reveals whether you believe some actions are inherently right or wrong regardless of their consequences, or whether moral rightness depends entirely on the results our actions produce. The tension between truth-telling and lying cuts to the heart of competing moral frameworks that have shaped Western ethical thought for centuries. On one side stands Immanuel Kant's deontological ethics, which treats truth-telling as an absolute moral duty that admits no exceptions. On the other side, utilitarian philosophers argue that lying can be not just permissible but morally required when it produces better consequences than truth-telling. This debate isn't merely academic. It plays out daily in courtrooms, hospitals, relationships, and political arenas where people must choose between honesty and other moral goods. Kant's position on lying appears uncompromising to the point of seeming absurd. In his essay, On a Supposed Right to Lie from Philanthropic Motives, Kant argues that lying is always morally wrong, even when telling the truth might lead to terrible consequences. According to Kant's categorical imperative, we must act only according to principles we could will to become universal laws. Since we cannot coherently will that everyone should lie, because lying presupposes a context of general truth-telling to be effective, lying violates the fundamental requirement of moral consistency. Kant's reasoning extends beyond mere logical consistency to deeper claims about human dignity and moral agency. Lying treats other people as means to our ends rather than as rational agents capable of making their own informed decisions. When we lie, We usurp others' autonomy by denying them access to truthful information they need to exercise their rational faculties. Even if our intentions are benevolent, lying shows disrespect for others' capacity to handle truth and make appropriate responses. Moreover, Kant argues that lying corrupts the liar's own moral agency. Truth-telling represents a duty we owe not just to others but to ourselves as rational beings. When we lie, we violate our own rational nature and undermine the foundations of moral reasoning. The categorical imperative demands that we maintain the integrity of our moral principles regardless of consequences, because compromising our principles for outcomes would make moral reasoning impossible. Applied to the Nazi scenario, Kant's position seems callously rigid. He would apparently require telling the truth even if it leads to murder, because lying violates absolute moral duties that cannot be overridden by consequentialist calculations. Critics argue that this position makes Kant complicit in the resulting deaths and demonstrates the absurdity of absolute moral rules divorced from concern for human welfare. But Kantian defenders offer more nuanced interpretations of his position. Some argue that Kant's prohibition applies specifically to lies, which are false statements intended to deceive, rather than to all forms of non-disclosure or misdirection. You might avoid lying to the Nazis by refusing to answer their questions, giving evasive responses that don't technically contain false statements, or finding creative ways to provide truthful but misleading information. Others suggest that Kant's moral framework includes competing duties that must be balanced against the duty of truth-telling. The duty not to contribute to murder might outweigh the duty to tell the truth in extreme circumstances. This interpretation makes Kant's ethics more flexible while maintaining the basic structure of duty-based moral reasoning. Utilitarian approaches to truth-telling offer a dramatically different perspective. Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and their intellectual descendants argue that the rightness or wrongness of lying depends entirely on its consequences. If lying produces better outcomes than truth-telling, more happiness, less suffering, greater overall welfare, then lying is not just permissible but morally required. From a utilitarian standpoint, the Nazi scenario presents a clear case for lying. Telling the truth would lead to the deaths of innocent people, causing enormous suffering for the victims and their families. Lying might save multiple lives at the cost of minor harm to the Nazi soldiers, who don't deserve truthful cooperation in their murderous enterprise anyway. The utilitarian calculation strongly favors deception in this case. Utilitarians can also account for the general value of truth-telling institutions while allowing exceptions in particular cases. Overall, societies function better when people generally tell the truth, creating trust that enables cooperation, communication, and social coordination. But these general benefits don't require absolute truth-telling in every individual case. We can maintain beneficial truth-telling practices while making exceptions when lies would produce significantly better consequences. This flexibility represents both utilitarianism's strength and its potential weakness in addressing truth-telling dilemmas. Utilitarian reasoning can justify lies in extreme cases like the Nazi scenario, but it might also rationalize deception in more ordinary circumstances where the consequentialist calculation is less clear-cut. If I can make my friend feel better by lying about her appearance, if I can avoid hurting someone's feelings by concealing my true opinion, if I can advance a good cause by exaggerating the facts, utilitarian logic might support these deceptions. The challenge lies in determining where to draw the line. Utilitarian reasoning requires accurate assessments of consequences, but predicting the results of lying versus truth-telling often proves difficult. Lies might have unintended effects that outweigh their intended benefits. They might be discovered, damaging relationships and undermining trust. They might set precedents that encourage further deception. The complexity of calculating consequences makes utilitarian guidance less straightforward than it initially appears. Rule utilitarianism attempts to address these challenges by focusing on the consequences of following general rules rather than the consequences of individual acts. Rule utilitarians might argue that we should generally follow a rule of truth-telling because societies with strong truth-telling norms produce better overall consequences than societies where lying is common. But they would allow exceptions to this rule when the stakes are sufficiently high, as in cases involving life and death. The debate between Kantian and utilitarian approaches to lying extends far beyond philosophical abstractions to practical ethical dilemmas that people face regularly. Medical professionals must decide whether to tell patients devastating diagnoses that might crush their hope, or whether to soften the truth to preserve their psychological well-being. Should doctors always provide complete, unvarnished medical information, Or can they justifiably withhold or modify information to protect patients' mental health? Legal contexts present similar dilemmas. Should lawyers always tell the complete truth in court, even when doing so might harm their clients' legitimate interests? What about witnesses who could provide information that would lead to just outcomes but might also expose them to retaliation or legal jeopardy? The adversarial legal system assumes that truth emerges from competing presentations of evidence, but this assumption might break down when truth-telling is dangerous or counterproductive. Political ethics raises questions about truth-telling in contexts where transparency might undermine important goals. Should government officials always reveal classified information when asked directly, even if disclosure might compromise national security or ongoing diplomatic negotiations? Can politicians justifiably make campaign promises they're uncertain about keeping, or exaggerate the benefits of policies they support? Democratic theory emphasizes the importance of informed citizenship, but complete transparency might sometimes conflict with effective governance. Personal relationships involve constant decisions about truth-telling and deception. Should you always tell your romantic partner exactly what you think about their friends, family, appearance, or choices? Can you justifiably conceal past relationships, financial problems, or other information that might cause pain or conflict? Most people intuitively recognize that relationships require some degree of tactful silence or gentle deception, but determining the appropriate boundaries proves challenging. Social media and digital communication technologies have created new contexts for truth-telling dilemmas. Online personas often involve carefully curated presentations of self that highlight positive aspects while concealing struggles, failures, or mundane realities. Are these presentations forms of harmless self-expression, or do they constitute deception that creates unrealistic expectations and social pressures? The rise of alternative facts, post-truth, politics, and deliberate misinformation campaigns has made questions about truth-telling more urgent and complex. When political actors systematically distort information to advance their agendas, how should institutions, media organizations, and individuals respond? Do we have special obligations to combat lies even when doing so might disadvantage us politically or socially? Artificial intelligence and automated systems raise new questions about truth-telling obligations. Should AI systems always provide accurate information to users, even when truthful responses might be harmful or counterproductive? Can chatbots or virtual assistants justifiably provide reassuring but false information to users who are distressed or suicidal? As AI systems become more sophisticated and human-like in their interactions, the ethical frameworks governing human truth-telling might need to be extended to artificial agents. Cross-cultural perspectives complicate universal claims about truth-telling obligations. Different cultures have varying norms about directness, politeness, and appropriate context for honesty. What counts as lying versus tactful communication differs across cultural contexts, suggesting that absolute rules about truth-telling might need to be sensitive to cultural variation while maintaining some universal core principles. The psychology of lying reveals additional complexities in moral evaluation. Research shows that people lie frequently in daily interactions, often for pro-social reasons like sparing others' feelings or maintaining social harmony. Many lies are spontaneous responses to social situations rather than deliberate attempts to deceive for personal gain. These findings suggest that moral frameworks for evaluating lying need to account for the psychological realities of human social interaction. As you reflect on these competing approaches to truth-telling tonight, consider your own practices and intuitions. When do you think lying is justified, if ever? Do you follow consistent principles in your truth-telling decisions, or do you make contextual judgments based on circumstances and consequences? Your approach to these questions reveals fundamental assumptions about moral reasoning, the value of honesty, and the proper balance between principle and pragmatism in ethical decision-making. The tension between Kantian duty and utilitarian consequences continues to shape moral dilemmas wherever human beings must choose between competing values and uncertain outcomes. Moral Relativism vs Moral Absolutism. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who genuinely believes that honor killings are morally justified because that's what their culture teaches. Meanwhile, you're horrified, convinced that murder is always wrong regardless of cultural context. Who's right? This isn't just an abstract philosophical debate, it's the fundamental tension between moral relativism and moral absolutism, and it's one of the most unsettling questions in ethics. Moral relativism suggests that ethical truths aren't universal constants floating somewhere in the cosmos, but rather products of specific cultures, societies, or even individual perspectives. Think of it like language. There's no inherently correct way to say hello, just different ways that work within different linguistic communities. Similarly, relativists argue moral practices like arranged marriages, polygamy, or even concepts of individual rights versus collective responsibility aren't inherently right or wrong. They're just different moral frameworks that emerge from different cultural soil. Consider the practice of elderly care. In many Western societies, placing aging parents in nursing homes is considered responsible and compassionate, ensuring they receive professional medical care while allowing younger generations to maintain their careers and nuclear families. But in many Eastern cultures, this same act would be viewed as a profound moral failure, an abandonment of filial duty that brings shame upon the entire family. The relativist asks, who's to say which approach is really right? But moral absolutism pushes back hard against this cultural fence-sitting. Absolutists maintain that certain moral truths transcend cultural boundaries, that some acts are objectively wrong regardless of context. They point to practices like female genital mutilation, slavery, or genocide and ask whether we're really prepared to say these could be morally acceptable just because some cultures have endorsed them. The absolutist argues that if we truly embrace relativism, we lose our moral compass entirely, becoming unable to critique injustice anywhere. Here's where it gets psychologically uncomfortable. Most of us are inconsistent relativists. We might accept cultural differences around dietary restrictions, marriage customs, or business practices, but we draw hard lines around human rights violations. We're relativistic about some things and absolutist about others, often without a clear principle governing where we draw these lines. Consider the death penalty debate through this lens. American states vary dramatically in their approach. Some execute criminals regularly while others have abolished capital punishment entirely. Is this simply regional moral variation that we should respect, like different accents or food preferences? Or is there an objective moral truth about whether the state should kill people, regardless of what local democratic processes decide? The relativist faces what philosophers call the tolerance paradox. If all moral systems are equally valid, what about moral systems that are themselves intolerant? Should we tolerate intolerance? If a culture's moral framework includes the belief that other cultures are inferior and should be dominated or eliminated, relativism seems to tie our hands. We can't condemn such views without imposing our own moral framework, which relativism says we have no right to do. Meanwhile, absolutists struggle with the whose absolutes problem. Even if we accept that some moral truths are universal, how do we determine what they are? Different religions, philosophical traditions, and rational systems arrive at different absolute moral conclusions. The Catholic natural law tradition reaches different absolutes than Buddhist ethics, which differs from secular utilitarian calculations, which differs from Islamic jurisprudence. Claiming your particular set of absolutes represents objective moral truth starts to look suspiciously like cultural imperialism dressed up in philosophical language. The stakes of this debate extend far beyond academic philosophy. International human rights law represents an attempt to establish moral absolutes, universal principles that transcend cultural difference. When the United Nations condemns authoritarian governments for suppressing dissent, they're making an absolutist claim that certain rights are universal. But critics argue this amounts to imposing Western liberal values on societies with different philosophical foundations. Consider how this plays out in contemporary medical ethics. Western medical practice emphasizes individual autonomy. Patients have the right to make their own treatment decisions, even if those decisions seem irrational to medical professionals. But in many cultures, medical decisions are made collectively by families or community elders, with individual patients expected to defer to communal wisdom. When Western-trained doctors work in non-Western contexts, whose ethical framework should govern? The individualistic approach that prioritizes patient autonomy, or the communalistic approach that prioritizes family and community input? The immigration debate reveals similar tensions. Relativists might argue that different societies can legitimately have different approaches to cultural integration, some prioritizing multiculturalism while others emphasizing assimilation. But absolutists ask whether there aren't universal principles of human dignity and equal treatment that should govern how any society treats newcomers. Even within families, these philosophical differences create real conflict. Parents raising children in multicultural contexts must decide which moral frameworks to emphasize. Do you teach your children that all cultural practices deserve equal respect? Or do you instill in them certain non-negotiable moral principles that transcend cultural context? The choice shapes how they'll navigate moral complexity throughout their lives. The psychological research adds another layer of complexity. Studies suggest that moral intuitions vary significantly across cultures, but certain moral foundations, like prohibitions against unprovoked harm or requirements for some form of fairness, appear remarkably consistent across human societies. This suggests a middle ground where some moral intuitions might be universal features of human psychology while their specific applications remain culturally variable. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this debate is how it forces us to confront the possibility that our deepest moral convictions might be nothing more than accidents of birth, products of the particular cultural moment and geographic location where we happen to emerge into consciousness. The relativist whispers that your moral outrage about practices in other cultures might be no more philosophically grounded than someone else's moral outrage about your practices. Yet something in us rebels against complete relativism. When we witness genuine cruelty or injustice, the conviction that it's objectively wrong feels too powerful to dismiss as mere cultural conditioning. The challenge is developing a framework that can acknowledge cultural difference while still maintaining the possibility of moral critique, that can be humble about the limits of our own moral vision while still asserting that some hills are worth dying on. As you drift toward sleep, consider your own moral landscape. Which of your ethical convictions feel genuinely universal, and which feel more like cultural preferences? How do you decide when to respect difference and when to stand firm on principle? In a world where moral certainty often leads to conflict but moral relativism can lead to paralysis, how do we navigate the narrow path between dogmatism and nihilism? These questions don't have easy answers, but wrestling with them shapes the kind of moral agents we become. The doctrine of double effect, intention versus foresight. Imagine you're a doctor treating a terminal cancer patient writhing in unbearable pain. You have two options: prescribe a morphine dose that will ease their suffering but might hasten their death, or withhold the medication and let them endure agonizing final days. Your intention is to relieve pain, not to kill, but you foresee that death might come sooner. Does your intention matter more than the foreseeable consequence? This is the heart of the doctrine of double effect, one of philosophy's most practically urgent moral frameworks. The doctrine of double effect emerged from medieval Catholic moral theology, but its implications stretch far beyond religious contexts into medical ethics, warfare, and everyday moral decision-making. The doctrine attempts to distinguish between intended consequences and merely foreseen ones, arguing that sometimes we can permissibly cause harm as a side effect of pursuing good, even when we couldn't permissibly cause that same harm directly. The classic formulation requires four conditions. First, the act itself must be morally neutral or good. You can't use double effect to justify inherently evil acts. Second, you must intend only the good effect, not the bad one. Third, the bad effect can't be a means to achieving the good effect. It must be a genuine side effect. Fourth, the good effect must outweigh the bad effect according to some reasonable proportionality calculation. Consider military ethics, where this doctrine does heavy lifting. A commander planning to bomb a munitions factory knows civilians in nearby buildings might be killed. The doctrine might justify this action if the commander's intention is to destroy military targets, not to kill civilians, if civilian deaths aren't a means to achieving the military objective, and if the strategic value outweighs the civilian casualties. But the same commander couldn't justify deliberately targeting civilians as a way to demoralize the enemy, even if the overall strategic outcome might be identical. The psychological sophistication required here is staggering. We're asking people to maintain perfect clarity about their own intentions while making life and death decisions under extreme pressure. But how reliably can we distinguish between intended and merely foreseen consequences when our minds are perfectly capable of self-deception? The commander might convince himself he's only targeting military assets while unconsciously relishing the terror civilian casualties will create. Medical contexts reveal the doctrine's complexity most clearly. Palliative sedation, rendering terminal patients unconscious to relieve unbearable suffering, often hastens death by suppressing respiratory function. Double effect analysis might justify this if doctors intend only to relieve suffering, not to end life. But critics argue this creates an artificial distinction. If you know your action will cause death and you proceed anyway, how meaningful is the claim that death wasn't intended? The abortion debate showcases these tensions dramatically. Consider ectopic pregnancies, where embryos implant outside the uterus and threaten maternal life. Catholic medical ethics permits removing the affected fallopian tube, allowing the embryo to die as a side effect, but prohibits directly terminating the embryo, even though both procedures have identical outcomes. The doctrine insists intention matters, removing diseased tissue versus killing embryos, but secular critics see meaningless hair splitting. Here's where the doctrine becomes psychologically unsettling. It seems to place enormous moral weight on mental states that might be fundamentally unknowable. When a pharmaceutical company prices life-saving medication at levels that ensure some patients can't afford it, they might claim they intend only to recoup research costs, not to cause deaths. The predictable deaths from lack of access are merely foreseen, not intended. But does this mental gymnastics really change the moral calculus? The doctrine also struggles with what philosophers call the closeness problem. How close must the connection be between intended good effects and foreseen bad ones? A factory owner might intend only to maximize profits while foreseeing that cost-cutting measures will create dangerous working conditions. A politician might intend only to win elections while foreseeing that inflammatory rhetoric will increase social tensions. At what point does foreseeability become so clear that we should treat it as intention? Consider autonomous vehicles, where programmers must make explicit decisions about accident scenarios. If a car's algorithm prioritizes passengers over pedestrians, programmers might claim they intend only to protect their customers, not to harm pedestrians. But when the algorithm inevitably faces situations where it must choose whom to sacrifice, can we maintain this distinction between intended and foreseen consequences? The doctrine's critics argue it creates a dangerous loophole for moral responsibility. By allowing people to disclaim responsibility for predictable consequences of their actions, it might actually encourage harmful behavior. If military commanders know they can justify civilian casualties by claiming they intended only military objectives, might they become less careful about minimizing civilian harm? Yet defenders argue the doctrine captures something essential about moral responsibility. They contend that intention genuinely matters, that there's a meaningful difference between a doctor who gives morphine to relieve pain and one who gives it to end life, even if both foresee the same outcome. The doctrine acknowledges that we live in a world where pursuing good often requires accepting bad side effects, and it provides a framework for navigating these tragic choices. The psychological research on moral judgment adds fascinating complexity. Studies suggest people naturally make distinctions between intended and merely foreseen consequences, but these intuitions vary across cultures and individuals. Some people show strong doctrine of double effect thinking, while others focus primarily on consequences regardless of intentions. This suggests the doctrine might reflect genuine features of human moral psychology rather than mere philosophical abstraction. Consider how this applies to climate change policy. Governments might claim they intend only to maintain economic growth while foreseeing that continued fossil fuel use will harm future generations. Does the doctrine allow them to disclaim responsibility for climate consequences as long as environmental damage wasn't their primary intention? Or does the severity and certainty of foreseen consequences create moral obligations regardless of intentions? The doctrine also raises questions about collective versus individual responsibility. When corporations make decisions through complex bureaucratic processes, whose intentions matter? The CEO who sets general policy, the middle manager who implements specific procedures, or the frontline worker who executes the plan? If different people in the chain have different intentions, how do we apply double effect analysis? Perhaps most unsettling is how the doctrine forces us to confront the limits of our own self-knowledge. We might believe we're acting from pure intentions while unconsciously pursuing selfish goals. The parent who claims to discipline children for their own good, while unconsciously venting frustration. The activist who claims to pursue justice while unconsciously seeking social status. The doctor who claims to prioritize patient welfare while unconsciously protecting professional reputation. The doctrine demands a level of introspective honesty that might be psychologically impossible. Yet it also provides a framework for thinking about moral responsibility in situations where pure consequences-based thinking seems inadequate. As you drift towards sleep, consider your own recent decisions where you caused harm while pursuing good. How confident are you about your own intentions? When foreseen consequences seem inevitable, does the distinction between intended and merely foreseen effects really matter? The doctrine of double effect doesn't provide easy answers, but it forces us to grapple with the complex relationship between our intentions, our actions, and our moral responsibilities. Issues of distributive justice, fair resource allocation. You have one kidney available for transplant and 5 patients who need it. One patient is a Nobel Prize-winning scientist on the verge of a breakthrough that could save millions. Another is a single mother of 4 young children. The third is a recovering drug addict who's been clean for 2 years. The fourth is a wealthy philanthropist who's donated billions to charity. The fifth is a perfectly ordinary person with no special achievements or circumstances. How do you decide who lives and who dies? This isn't just a medical ethics thought experiment. It's the fundamental challenge of distributive justice that shapes every aspect of how societies allocate scarce resources. Distributive justice asks perhaps the most practically urgent question in ethics. When there isn't enough to go around, how should we decide who gets what? This question haunts every level of human organization, from families deciding how to divide attention among children to nations determining how to allocate healthcare, education, and economic opportunities. The stakes couldn't be higher. Our answers literally determine who thrives and who suffers. The philosophical landscape offers several competing frameworks, each with profound implications for how we structure society. Utilitarianism suggests we should distribute resources to maximize overall well-being, give resources to whoever will benefit most from them. This might mean prioritizing those who can convert resources into the greatest happiness, which often means helping those who currently have the least, since additional resources typically provide more benefit to the poor than to the rich. But utilitarian distribution raises uncomfortable questions. Should we prioritize people who are naturally happier or more capable of experiencing pleasure? Should we give more resources to those with expensive tastes if satisfying those tastes would create more overall happiness? The utilitarian calculus might justify taking organs from healthy individuals to save multiple patients, or redistributing resources based on people's capacity for happiness rather than their needs or efforts. Rawlsian justice offers a different approach through the famous veil of ignorance thought experiment. Imagine designing society's distribution system without knowing your own position, your talents, social class, gender, race, or even your conception of what makes life worth living. Rawls argues you'd choose a system that protects the worst off because you might end up in that position yourself. This difference principle allows inequalities only if they benefit society's least advantaged members. The veil of ignorance produces counterintuitive results. It might justify paying surgeons more than janitors if higher medical salaries attract talent that ultimately benefits everyone, including janitors who need medical care. But it would prohibit inequalities that exist merely because some people happen to be born with marketable talents. Your ability to throw a ball, solve equations, or charm audiences might be valuable to society, but the veil of ignorance suggests you don't deserve extra resources simply because you won the genetic lottery. Libertarian justice takes a radically different approach, emphasizing individual rights and voluntary exchanges. Robert Nozick argues that distributions are just if they arise from legitimate acquisitions and voluntary transfers, regardless of the resulting patterns. If someone acquires property through honest work or voluntary exchange, they're entitled to keep it, even if others have greater needs. The libertarian asks, by what right does society take from some to give to others, even for seemingly noble purposes? This framework produces its own uncomfortable implications. If you inherit billions while others inherit nothing, libertarian justice might defend this inequality as long as the original acquisition was legitimate and the inheritance was voluntary. But critics ask whether truly voluntary exchanges are possible when people start with vastly different resources and opportunities. Can a desperately poor person really freely choose to work in dangerous conditions for minimal wages? Merit-based distribution offers another approach. Give resources to those who deserve them through their efforts, achievements, or virtues. This appeals to our sense that hard work should be rewarded and laziness shouldn't be subsidized. But merit-based systems face the challenge of defining merit fairly. Should we reward effort, results, or some combination? How do we account for differences in natural abilities, educational opportunities, or family support that make merit possible? Consider how differently these frameworks would handle healthcare allocation. Utilitarians might prioritize treatments that save the most life years or provide the greatest quality of life improvements. Rawlsians might ensure everyone has access to basic healthcare before anyone gets luxury treatments. Libertarians might allow healthcare to be distributed through market mechanisms, with individuals responsible for their own medical expenses. Merit-based systems might provide better care to those who've maintained healthy lifestyles or contributed more to society. The psychological research reveals how deeply our intuitions about distributive justice vary. Some people are naturally more equality-focused, while others prioritize proportionality or need-based distribution. These differences correlate with personality traits, cultural backgrounds, and political orientations. What feels obviously fair to one person strikes another as manifestly unjust. Real-world distribution systems typically combine elements from multiple frameworks, creating complex hybrid approaches that satisfy no one completely. Progressive taxation reflects Rawlsian concerns for the worst off, while allowing market-based distribution reflects libertarian values. Merit scholarships reward achievement while need-based aid helps those with fewer resources. These compromises might be practically necessary, but they create internal tensions and contradictions. Consider how these frameworks apply to education. Should elite universities admit students based on merit, test scores and grades? Need, helping those from disadvantaged backgrounds? Diversity, ensuring representation across different groups? Or legacy preferences, rewarding family connections? Each approach reflects different values about what makes distribution fair, and any actual admission system must somehow balance these competing claims. The global dimension adds another layer of complexity. How should resources be distributed across national boundaries? Do wealthy countries have obligations to help poorer ones? Should we prioritize helping our own citizens or focus on global poverty where resources might do more good? The frameworks that seem reasonable within societies produce different answers when applied globally. Climate change presents perhaps the most challenging distributive justice problem of our time. How should we allocate the costs of addressing climate change when those who contributed least to the problem, developing countries, future generations, stand to suffer most from its consequences? Should distribution be based on historical emissions, current capacity to pay, or future vulnerability? The framework we choose will determine which countries bear the costs of climate action and which receive assistance. The intergenerational dimension is particularly troubling. Current generations consume resources and emit carbon in ways that will constrain future generations' opportunities. By what right do we impose these costs on people who haven't been born yet? But future people can't negotiate with us or offer compensation for our restraint. How do we apply distributive justice across time when the affected parties can't participate in the decision-making process? Technology is creating new distributive challenges. Should genetic enhancements be distributed through market mechanisms, potentially creating permanent biological castes? How should we allocate access to artificial intelligence, space resources, or life extension technologies? The frameworks developed for traditional resources might not apply to goods that could fundamentally transform human nature or society. Perhaps most unsettling is how distributive justice forces us to confront the role of luck in human life. Your talents, family background, country of birth, and historical moment all shape your opportunities in ways you didn't choose. Some frameworks try to compensate for these inequalities while others treat them as morally irrelevant. But none can fully escape the fact that much of what determines life outcomes lies beyond individual control. As you drift towards sleep, consider the distributive choices in your own life. How do you allocate your time, attention, and resources among competing claims? What principles guide your decisions about charity, taxation, or support for various social programs? When you benefit from systems that disadvantage others, how do you think about your obligations? The questions of distributive justice aren't just abstract philosophical puzzles. They're the concrete challenges that shape every society's character and every individual's moral standing. The ethics of punishment, retribution versus rehabilitation. Imagine watching security footage of someone violently attacking an elderly stranger for no apparent reason. Part of you wants that person to suffer, to experience consequences proportional to the harm they caused. But another part of you wonders what led to this moment, whether punishment will prevent future violence, and whether society might be better served by trying to fix whatever broke in this person's life. This tension between retribution and rehabilitation sits at the heart of criminal justice, forcing us to confront fundamental questions about human nature, moral responsibility, and the purpose of punishment. The retributive approach to punishment operates on the intuition that wrongdoing deserves punishment, that there's something morally fitting about making people pay for their crimes. This isn't just about deterrence or prevention, it's about moral balance. When someone commits a crime, they've upset the moral order, and punishment restores that balance by ensuring wrongdoers get what they deserve. The retributivist argues that punishment is justified even if it doesn't prevent future crimes or benefit anyone. Some acts are so wrong that punishment becomes a moral imperative. This framework has deep emotional and philosophical appeal. When we hear about particularly heinous crimes, something in us demands that justice be done, that the perpetrator face consequences proportional to their actions. The retributivist captures this intuition, arguing that punishment honors both the dignity of victims and the moral agency of offenders. To fail to punish serious wrongdoing would be to treat criminals as less than fully human, unable to be held responsible for their choices. But retributive justice faces challenging questions about proportionality and moral luck. How do we determine what punishment fits what crime? The ancient principle of an eye for an eye provided clear guidance, but modern societies reject literal reciprocity. We don't rape rapists or torture torturers. Instead, we try to match the severity of punishment to the severity of crime through complex sentencing guidelines that inevitably involve subjective judgments about comparative harm and desert. The rehabilitation model approaches punishment from an entirely different angle, focusing on preventing future crimes by addressing the underlying causes of criminal behavior. Rather than asking what offenders deserve, rehabilitation asks what interventions might transform them into law-abiding citizens. This approach treats crime as a symptom of deeper problems, mental illness, addiction, poverty, trauma, or social dysfunction, that can potentially be addressed through therapy, education, job training, or medical treatment. Rehabilitation appeals to our sense of human dignity and potential for change. It suggests that people aren't defined by their worst moments, that everyone deserves a chance at redemption. The rehabilitative approach also seems more practical. If we can actually prevent future crimes, society benefits more than if we simply make offenders suffer. Countries with rehabilitation-focused justice systems often have lower recidivism rates than those emphasizing punishment, suggesting this approach might be more effective at protecting public safety. Yet rehabilitation faces its own philosophical and practical challenges. Some critics argue it's too soft on criminals, failing to acknowledge the moral significance of their choices. If we treat criminals primarily as victims of circumstances who need help rather than moral agents who deserve punishment, are we really taking their agency seriously? The rehabilitation model might inadvertently infantilize offenders by suggesting they're not fully responsible for their actions. The practical challenges are equally daunting. Many jurisdictions lack resources for effective rehabilitation programs. Even well-funded programs show mixed results. Some offenders respond well to treatment while others continue offending despite intensive intervention. Critics argue that rehabilitation is a luxury society can't afford when resources are limited and public safety is at stake. Consider how these frameworks apply to specific cases. A teenager from an abusive home commits armed robbery. The retributivist focuses on the harm caused to victims and the choice to commit crime, arguing that punishment is deserved regardless of background circumstances. The rehabilitationist emphasizes the underlying trauma and social conditions that led to criminal behavior, arguing that addressing these root causes serves society better than punishment alone. The death penalty represents the starkest expression of retributive justice, the ultimate punishment for the ultimate crime. Supporters argue that some acts are so heinous that only death can provide adequate moral response. But rehabilitation advocates point out that execution permanently forecloses any possibility of redemption or contribution to society. The debate reveals fundamental disagreements about human nature, the possibility of change, and the state's role in delivering moral justice. Restorative justice offers a third approach that tries to bridge retributive and rehabilitative concerns. Rather than focusing on punishment or treatment, restorative justice emphasizes repairing harm and rebuilding relationships. This might involve bringing offenders face to face with victims, requiring community service that directly addresses the harm caused, or creating opportunities for dialogue and understanding. The goal is healing rather than punishment or correction. Restorative approaches appeal to our desire for meaningful accountability without pure retribution. They acknowledge harm while creating opportunities for redemption. Victims often report greater satisfaction with restorative processes than traditional criminal justice procedures. But critics argue that restorative justice works only for relatively minor crimes and willing participants. It might be inappropriate or ineffective for serious violence or unrepentant offenders. The psychological research on punishment reveals the complexity of human moral intuitions. People simultaneously hold retributive and consequentialist beliefs about punishment, often without recognizing the tensions between them. We want criminals to suffer for their crimes but also want the criminal justice system to prevent future crimes. We believe in personal responsibility but also recognize the power of circumstances to shape behavior. These contradictions play out in public policy debates. Voters often support tough-on-crime politicians who promise harsh sentences, but they also support rehabilitation programs that promise to reduce recidivism. We want justice to be both backward-looking, punishing past wrongs, and forward-looking, preventing future harms, even when these goals conflict. The juvenile justice system illustrates these tensions most clearly. When children commit serious crimes, should we focus on punishment proportional to the harm caused or on rehabilitation appropriate to their developmental stage? Most jurisdictions try to balance both concerns, but the results are often unsatisfying to everyone involved. We're uncomfortable treating children as fully responsible moral agents deserving adult punishment, but we're also uncomfortable ignoring serious harms simply because the perpetrator is young. Mental illness adds another layer of complexity. How should we respond to crimes committed by people with severe mental health problems? Pure retribution seems inappropriate if the person lacked the capacity for moral reasoning. But pure rehabilitation might feel inadequate to victims and their families. Society needs protection from dangerous individuals, but it also has obligations to provide treatment rather than punishment for those who are genuinely ill. The economics of punishment create additional complications. Incarceration is expensive. It costs more to keep someone in prison for a year than to send them to college. Rehabilitation programs require upfront investment but might save money in the long run by reducing recidivism. Yet political incentives often favor visible punishment over invisible prevention, leading to policies that might be neither just nor effective. Cultural differences in punishment philosophy reveal how much our intuitions depend on social context. Some societies emphasize individual responsibility and proportional punishment, while others focus on community harmony and restoration. What feels obviously just in one cultural context might seem barbaric or inadequate in another. As you drift toward sleep, consider your own intuitions about punishment. When someone wrongs you, do you want them to suffer, to change, or to make amends? How do you balance your desire for justice with your recognition that people are shaped by circumstances beyond their control? When you think about society's most serious crimes, what would truly serve justice? Making sure offenders get what they deserve, transforming them into better people, or finding some other way to respond to moral wrongdoing? The tension between retribution and rehabilitation isn't just a policy debate. It's a fundamental question about human nature and the possibility of redemption. Future generations' ethics, obligations to the unborn. Close your eyes and imagine someone who will be born in the year 2150. They're living in a world shaped by decisions we're making right now, decisions about climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and resource consumption. This person's life will be profoundly affected by choices we make today, yet they have no voice in our democratic processes, no way to negotiate with us, no ability to offer us compensation or threaten us with consequences. Do we owe them anything? This is the puzzle of future generations' ethics. How to think about moral obligations to people who don't yet exist. The challenge of future generations' ethics strikes at the heart of moral philosophy because it violates our usual assumptions about ethical relationships. Typically, we think about ethics in terms of reciprocal relationships between existing people who can communicate, negotiate, and hold each other accountable. But future people can't participate in these relationships. They're not here to tell us what they want, to object to our decisions, or to reciprocate our sacrifices. They exist only in potential, as ghostly possibilities that may or may not come to pass. Yet our decisions will shape their world in ways both subtle and profound. Climate change represents perhaps the most urgent example. Current generations are emitting greenhouse gases at rates that will almost certainly create more dangerous weather patterns, higher sea levels, and more severe droughts for future generations. We're essentially conducting a massive experiment with the planet's climate system, and future people will live with the results whether they like it or not. The economic dimension is equally troubling. Government debt allows current generations to consume more than they produce, with the bills passed to future taxpayers. Infrastructure investments, or the lack thereof, will determine whether future generations inherit functional transportation systems, reliable power grids, and well-maintained public spaces. Educational and research investments today shape the knowledge and technological capabilities future generations will have available. But future generations' ethics becomes philosophically complex because of what's called the non-identity problem. Our decisions don't just affect the welfare of future people. They affect which future people will exist. If we choose different climate policies, different people will meet, marry, and have children. The specific individuals who exist in 2150 depend on the precise sequence of decisions we make today. Can we harm people by making decisions that affect their very existence? Consider this puzzle. If we continue current environmental policies, Child A will be born into a world with significant climate change. If we adopt stricter policies, the social disruption might mean that Child A is never born, but Child B is born into a better environment. Did our choice of environmental policy harm Child A, who wouldn't exist in the alternative scenario? How do we weigh the interests of possible people against the interests of different possible people? The problem becomes even more complex when we consider that our obligations to future generations might conflict with our obligations to currently existing people. Aggressive climate action might require sacrifices from today's poor to benefit tomorrow's wealthy, since economic growth will likely make future generations richer than current ones, even accounting for climate damages. Is it fair to ask today's impoverished to sacrifice for tomorrow's affluent? But if we don't act, we might be imposing catastrophic risks on future generations who will be unable to adapt. Rights-based approaches to future generations' ethics face similar puzzles. Can people who don't yet exist have rights? If so, how do we determine what those rights are? Future people might have different values, preferences, and concepts of human flourishing than we do. The environmental preservation we think we owe them might actually constrain their choices in ways they would reject. They might prefer to inherit advanced technology and wealth rather than pristine wilderness, or they might value things we can't imagine. The technological dimension adds another layer of complexity. We're developing artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and nanotechnology that could transform human nature itself. Future people might have enhanced cognitive abilities, extended lifespans, or integrated digital biological systems that make them fundamentally different from current humans. Do we have obligations to preserve natural humanity for future generations, or would this constrain their autonomous choices about their own development? Consider genetic enhancement technologies. If we could eliminate genetic diseases, enhance intelligence, or extend healthy lifespan, do we have obligations to develop these technologies for future generations? Or would such interventions impose our values on people who might prefer to remain natural humans? The choice to develop or not develop genetic enhancements will shape the fundamental biological reality of future generations. Religious and cultural transmission raises similar questions. Every generation faces choices about which traditions, values, and practices to pass on to their children. These decisions shape the cultural landscape future generations will inherit. Do we have obligations to preserve cultural diversity for future generations? Or would this constrain their autonomous choices about their own values and ways of life? The population ethics dimension is perhaps the most perplexing. Do we have obligations to bring future people into existence, or only obligations to people who will exist regardless of our choices? If we could create a future world with billions of people living moderately good lives, would that be better or worse than a world with millions of people living excellent lives? The total amount of well-being might be higher in the first scenario, but the average well-being might be higher in the second. Some philosophers argue that we should focus on creating the best possible lives for future generations, while others argue we should focus on creating the largest number of good lives. Still others suggest that future people have no claim on us until they actually exist, so we have no obligations to create them but strong obligations to provide well for them if they do exist. The uncertainty problem makes these calculations even more difficult. We can't predict with certainty what future generations will value, what technologies they'll have available, or what challenges they'll face. Climate models give us probabilities, not certainties. Economic projections become increasingly unreliable as we extend them further into the future. How do we make ethical decisions under such profound uncertainty? Some philosophers suggest we should focus on preserving options for future generations rather than trying to predict their specific needs. This might mean maintaining environmental systems, investing in education and research, and avoiding irreversible changes that would constrain future choices. The goal would be to give future generations the broadest possible menu of options rather than trying to optimize their specific outcomes. But even this approach raises questions about whose conception of valuable options we should use. Future generations might value things we can't imagine or reject things we think are essential. They might prefer to live in artificial environments rather than natural ones, or they might develop forms of consciousness that don't fit our categories of human flourishing. International cooperation makes these challenges even more complex. Future generations' ethics requires coordination across countries and cultures with different values, economic systems, and time horizons. What seems like an obvious obligation to future generations in one cultural context might seem like unnecessary sacrifice in another. How do we build international consensus around obligations to people who don't yet exist? The psychological research suggests that humans have difficulty caring about abstract future people. We're naturally biased toward present concerns and people we know personally. Future generations remain abstract statistical possibilities rather than concrete individuals who evoke our empathy. This psychological limitation might explain why democratic societies struggle to make sacrifices for future benefit. Yet something in us recognizes that future generations' ethics matters deeply. Parents naturally make sacrifices for their children's future welfare. Societies invest in education, infrastructure, and research that will benefit future generations more than current ones. Environmental movements mobilize around obligations to future generations. We seem to have intuitive recognition that our decisions should consider their impact on people not yet born. As you drift toward sleep, consider your own relationship to future generations. What kind of world do you want to leave for people who will be born after you're gone? How do you balance your present needs and desires against obligations to the unborn? When you make decisions about career, consumption, political participation, or family planning, how much do you consider their impact on future generations? The puzzle of future generations' ethics doesn't have clear answers, but grappling with it shapes how we understand our responsibilities as temporary stewards of human civilization. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who genuinely believes that honor killings are morally justified because that's what their culture teaches. Meanwhile, you're horrified, convinced that murder is always wrong regardless of cultural context. Who's right? This isn't just an abstract philosophical debate. It's the fundamental tension between moral relativism and moral absolutism, and it's one of the most unsettling questions in ethics. Moral relativism suggests that ethical truths aren't universal constants floating somewhere in the cosmos, but rather products of specific cultures, societies, or even individual perspectives. Think of it like language. There's no inherently correct way to say hello, just different ways that work within different linguistic communities. Similarly, relativists argue moral practices like arranged marriages, polygamy, or even concepts of individual rights versus collective responsibility aren't inherently right or wrong. They're just different moral frameworks that emerge from different cultural soil. Consider the practice of elderly care. In many Western societies, placing aging parents in nursing homes is considered responsible and compassionate, ensuring they receive professional medical care while allowing younger generations to maintain their careers and nuclear families. But in many Eastern cultures, this same act would be viewed as a profound moral failure, an abandonment of filial duty that brings shame upon the entire family. The relativist asks, who's to say which approach is really right? But moral absolutism pushes back hard against this cultural fence-sitting. Absolutists maintain that certain moral truths transcend cultural boundaries, that some acts are objectively wrong regardless of context. They point to practices like female genital mutilation, slavery, or genocide and ask whether we're really prepared to say these could be morally acceptable just because some cultures have endorsed them. The absolutist argues that if we truly embrace relativism, we lose our moral compass entirely, becoming unable to critique injustice anywhere. Here's where it gets psychologically uncomfortable. Most of us are inconsistent relativists. We might accept cultural differences around dietary restrictions, marriage customs, or business practices, but we draw hard lines around human rights violations. We're relativistic about some things and absolutist about others, often without a clear principle governing where we draw these lines. Consider the death penalty debate through this lens. American states vary dramatically in their approach. Some execute criminals regularly while others have abolished capital punishment entirely. Is this simply regional moral variation that we should respect, like different accents or food preferences? Or is there an objective moral truth about whether the state should kill people, regardless of what local democratic processes decide? The relativist faces what philosophers call the tolerance paradox. If all moral systems are equally valid, what about moral systems that are themselves intolerant? Should we tolerate intolerance? If a culture's moral framework includes the belief that other cultures are inferior and should be dominated or eliminated, relativism seems to tie our hands. We can't condemn such views without imposing our own moral framework, which relativism says we have no right to do. Meanwhile, absolutists struggle with the whose absolutes problem. Even if we accept that some moral truths are universal, how do we determine what they are? Different religions, philosophical traditions, and rational systems arrive at different absolute moral conclusions. The Catholic natural law tradition reaches different absolutes than Buddhist ethics, which differs from secular utilitarian calculations, which differs from Islamic jurisprudence. Claiming your particular set of absolutes represents objective moral truth starts to look suspiciously like cultural imperialism dressed up in philosophical language. The stakes of this debate extend far beyond academic philosophy. International human rights law represents an attempt to establish moral absolutes, universal principles that transcend cultural difference. When the United Nations condemns authoritarian governments for suppressing dissent, they're making an absolutist claim that certain rights are universal. But critics argue this amounts to imposing Western liberal values on societies with different philosophical foundations. Consider how this plays out in contemporary medical ethics. Western medical practice emphasizes individual autonomy. Patients have the right to make their own treatment decisions, even if those decisions seem irrational to medical professionals. But in many cultures, medical decisions are made collectively by families or community elders, with individual patients expected to defer to communal wisdom. When Western-trained doctors work in non-Western contexts, whose ethical framework should govern? The individualistic approach that prioritizes patient autonomy, or the communalistic approach that prioritizes family and community input? The immigration debate reveals similar tensions. Relativists might argue that different societies can legitimately have different approaches to cultural integration, some prioritizing multiculturalism while others emphasizing assimilation. But absolutists ask whether there aren't universal principles of human dignity and equal treatment that should govern how any society treats newcomers. Even within families, these philosophical differences create real conflict. Parents raising children in multicultural contexts must decide which moral frameworks to emphasize. Do you teach your children that all cultural practices deserve equal respect? Or do you instill in them certain non-negotiable moral principles that transcend cultural context? The choice shapes how they'll navigate moral complexity throughout their lives. The psychological research adds another layer of complexity. Studies suggest that moral intuitions vary significantly across cultures, but certain moral foundations, like prohibitions against unprovoked harm or requirements for some form of fairness, appear remarkably consistent across human societies. This suggests a middle ground where some moral intuitions might be universal features of human psychology while their specific applications remain culturally variable. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this debate is how it forces us to confront the possibility that our deepest moral convictions might be nothing more than accidents of birth, products of the particular cultural moment and geographic location where we happen to emerge into consciousness. The relativist whispers that your moral outrage about practices in other cultures might be no more philosophically grounded than someone else's moral outrage about your practices. Yet something in us rebels against complete relativism. When we witness genuine cruelty or injustice, the conviction that it's objectively wrong feels too powerful to dismiss as mere cultural conditioning. The challenge is developing a framework that can acknowledge cultural difference while still maintaining the possibility of moral critique, that can be humble about the limits of our own moral vision while still asserting that some hills are worth dying on. As you drift toward sleep, consider your own moral landscape. Which of your ethical convictions feel genuinely universal, and which feel more like cultural preferences? How do you decide when to respect difference and when to stand firm on principle? In a world where moral certainty often leads to conflict but moral relativism can lead to paralysis, how do we navigate the narrow path between dogmatism and nihilism? These questions don't have easy answers, but wrestling with them shapes the kind of moral agents we become.